Forest Advisor and County Director in Humboldt and North counties for the University of California Cooperative Extension. So I will set up that presentation and invite Yana to begin.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? No? Can you hear me, Mike?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks. Very good. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today and be with you all today. I'm going to talk about wildfire mitigation strategies, and this is work that I have done with the University of California in partnership with Dr. Steve Quarles, who's also the recently retired chief scientist for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Next slide, please. I don't know if you want to go into presentation mode or not, but one back, please. Mike, can you go back one? Very good, thank you. So for today's talk, I'd like to talk about some vocabulary building, and I think touch on some of the key concepts that Commissioner Laura laid out and be able to contribute to the conversation around how we think about this in a modeling aspect. Where I'd like to start is thinking about fire exposures themselves and what we need to prepare for. I'm going to touch on defensible space and what are some of the challenging issues associated with defensible space strategies, and talk about Zone Zero, which is the missing ingredient in our implementation strategies. And then I'm going to spend some time in home hardening and thinking about retrofitting and prioritization. When I talk about these issues, I really want to context them in that we need multi-pronged solutions and actions at many scales. And while we're going to drill into this home hardening piece and the defensible space piece, we have to continue to address average fire conditions while simultaneously planning for critical fire weather conditions when fire response is stretched thin. So there is no silver bullet here. We need to take action on many fronts. Next slide, please. And so when you put this in context around the facets of fire resiliency, there are many dials to turn around ways that we as a society can improve our outcomes when it comes to wildfire. Today, we're going to hear about wildland management strategies and prescribed fire. We're also going to hear about fire resilient homes, but there's a whole landscape of issues and challenges of which we need to turn all the dials. And what I find interesting is how much insurance crosses so many of the different ways that we have opportunity for improvement across the West, the American West, and the state of California. Next slide, please. I think there's a bit of a delay on my end, so I'm not sure exactly what you all are seeing. I'm still on the facets of fire resiliency slide here. When it comes to these issues, there are opportunities for action and improvement across the board. So I'm stalling here a bit because I'm trying to wait for the slide to advance. One of the things, very good, thank you very much. So for starting us off in this conversation, I want to remind folks that fuel is anything that will burn. And when we talk about fire behavior, fuel is the only component of the fire behavior triangle that we can affect. And we typically talk about it, we think about vegetation such as trees, shrubs, or grass, and they're all capable of translating fire to a building clearly. But there are key issues around and in our buildings that are also particularly vulnerable to ignition, and that includes wood mulch, includes furniture, and includes the structures that we build around our buildings, such as decks and arbors and trellises and planter boxes, and it also includes the home itself. And in many respects, the home is the most combustible part of the landscape. Next, please. So while you think about those issues, step outside your own building and look at what is capable of carrying a fire. What drives many of our fires are embers, and these embers are burning bits of vegetation or components of buildings that have ignited. And those components or the vegetation once it is as an ember, it's able to be moved in the fire column and through the wind, and can find all the little nooks and crannies, all the small places for vulnerability in and around our buildings. So as a result of this, next please, what we see is that typical fire defense strategies and defensible space are easily overwhelmed because those embers can move across highways, they can move maybe up to a mile or more, and you have cases like this where the vegetation wasn't involved at all, and it wasn't that an alien came down from space and annihilated this building. It's more likely what happened is that an ember was able to move across this landscape, find a gap or an opening in the building, either an open window or a vent, which is critical for letting the moist air out of our buildings, and create an entry point into the house, or find an entry point into the house and create ignition. So these embers are able to bypass typical defense strategies, and they often overwhelm a lot of the components on our buildings because we haven't really thought about how to prepare for them. Next slide, please. So there are three types of fire exposures that I want people to be aware of. We most typically think about direct flame contact, where you have a fire that's carried from a wildland-urban interface directly to the building and creates ignition right on the building. But I've been highlighting here this issue of embers that are able to bypass our typical defensible space strategies and either create ignition on or within our buildings. But there's a third component that's also really important, and that is radiant heat. And this is particularly important when we have outbuildings or when we have homes that are close to each other. Because once you have ignition in a neighboring building, the radiant heat, the convective heat, can often break windows and create a place for penetration into our building. Our educational messages largely have focused on preparing for direct flame contact through our defensible space strategies, but preparing for embers and radiant heat takes a really different approach. I'm really pleased to see that AB 3074 was signed by the governor this year, which is going to dial in some of our defensible space work to help us with ember preparedness. Next, please. So when we think about defensible space, we need to sort of reorient our framing from working from the house outward. This isn't a problem of our neighbors, it's often a problem of our own issues. So what we're trying to do is get people to become more aware about this new zone 0, which is critical for ember defense, which is around the first 5 feet of the perimeter of the building and any attachments like decks or stairs. And then the typical modifications that we've seen in the next 2 zones emanating out from the house are critical for being able to put crews safely to be able to defend our homes and also mitigate the pathway of fire towards our buildings. Next, please. So let's just look a little bit at some of the vulnerable locations on our buildings. There are roof-to-wall intersections. There are issues with gutters filling with debris and then ignition within gutters. There's also the capacity for fences to ignite and bring fire directly to our building, or these issues of penetration via our vents. These are some interior pictures taken from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's lab, where you can see the embers penetrating our typical mesh size on our gable end or our under eave vents. And if there's something that's receptive inside our building, then we can have ignition inside our building. So being able to think about home hardening means being able to pay attention to the small details. Next slide, please. And it's much more than just having a metal roof or non-combustible siding. So if you look at this cinder block constructed home, you can see that that was not enough. Right? It's not just about one product. It's about the whole assembly. It's about the design, the maintenance, and the construction. All of that comes together to be more important than any one particular fire resilient building product itself. And the installation, the lack of maintenance can increase the vulnerability of any one product. So there's a lot of news out there about it's all about cement. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And it's really about thinking about those gaps, those openings, and those places for ignition and penetration to our buildings. Next, please. So just looking more broadly at a building itself, it's the roof, it's the metal drip edge, it's the decks, it's the windows, it's the gate attachment, it's the vents, it's all of these pieces that have to work together for our building to be resilient towards the 3 different types of fire exposures. Next, please. And so how do you prioritize in the sea of words and language and all these choices that are out there? So really what we are trying to get people to think about, the highest priorities are the roofs, the vents, upgrading to new ember and flame resistant vents, and the defensible space right near the home. Those are the highest priorities. But your situation, your context also is important. When you're on steep slopes, the mitigation for defensible space increases. And if you're in dense neighborhoods where buildings are less than 30 feet apart from each other, then you've got radiant heat issues that are an additional challenge. And that's when the windows and the siding can also become kind of critical factors in how we make our improvements. And my last slide, please. And I'll say, when it comes to our work in Paradise, we've been analyzing the data from Paradise, and I really see a community effect. I mean, we're only as strong as our weakest neighbor when you think about these issues. What we see is that the biggest predictor of loss is the distance to the nearest lost home. So if your neighbor goes, the likelihood that you're going to go as your home being consumed by fire increases substantially. So as I conclude, what I really want to say is that the home loss issue from wildfire is predictable, but there's reason for hope, and there are things that we can do as individual people, as a society, to try and address these issues. And really what we need to be thinking more clearly about is, how do we adapt and build smarter? How do we retrofit what we have? We don't just have a fighting force for fire, but how do we actually get to the place where we think about managing it in the same way that we have with earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes? We've made significant adaptations as a society. The majority of homes, they happen to be ignited from embers, but the good news is that the new California Wildland Urban Interface construction standards are helping, but we have to figure out how we incentivize upgrades to our existing homes, both for ember and radiant heat exposures, and we need to figure out how we incentivize people being ready to adopt the 5-foot non-combustible defensible space zone. Thank you very much for the time to be with you today. I look forward to the next programs.
Thank you, Yana. I appreciate your presentation. And thanks for hanging in there with the slight technical difficulties there. While I pull up the next presentation, I want to introduce Margot Robbins, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council.
Can you hear me now? Ayakwi, Neknau Margot Robbins, Keechnak, a Yurok tribal member, co-founder and executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council, as well as co-lead and advisor for the Indigenous Peoples Burn Network. Thank you for this opportunity to share information about traditional and contemporary use of prescribed fire and its role in mitigating the effects of wildfire. The Cultural Fire Management Council, CFMC, is a community-based nonprofit organization located on the Yurok Reservation in far northern California. CFMC was formed as a means to reinstate traditional burn practices and protect our community from wildfire. This land evolved with fire. Some plants are fire dependent while others benefit from fire. Fire is meant to be part of the ecosystem. California First Nations depend on it for the continuance of our cultural lifeways. We used fire for thousands of years to ensure a balanced ecosystem. Traditionally, each family, each tribe took personal responsibility for maintaining the land with fire. Our ancestors burned from the coastline to the high country. The land was a mosaic of fire-treated land at different stages of growth. These low-intensity burns improved the soil, purified the water, improved animal habitat, and minimized the fuel load, which also served to protect villages from wildfire. Next slide, please. The Cultural Fire Management Council has adapted these traditional burn practices to accommodate the changed landscape and laws we now live with. We have been doing cultural burns for 7 years now with 0 escapes. We have a family-led burn program, which enables families to burn around their homes and gathering places, and also host a firefighter training program called TREX twice a year. TREX events are landscape level burns conducted with qualified firefighters, fire engines, and a burn plan approved by CAL FIRE. These 7 to 14-day events provide hands-on experience in prescribed fire implementation and ecosystem restoration while creating fire breaks for wildfire prevention. Next slide. We burn on private fee land as well as land owned by the tribe. Other TREX events take place on land owned by the state and federal Park Service, BLM, private fee land, and the U.S. Forest Service. Left unattended, our forests become overloaded with fuel, thick with brush, with layer upon layer of leaf litter. Perfect conditions for an uncontrolled wildfire. Next slide. Purposeful fire set during favorable conditions clears the understory of brush, dry leaves, and other woody debris, leaving the trees unharmed. We start at the top of the slope and back the fire slowly down the mountain, consuming the brush and woody debris on the forest floor. You can actually see through this forest that has been treated with prescribed fire. There's no fuel to carry a fire up into the canopy of these trees. Deer come to roll in the ashes to rid themselves of ticks and fleas. They will return in the spring to browse on the nutritious new growth and raise their young. As we up the pace and scale of prescribed burns, they will be an important strategy in reducing the spread and impact of wildfire and improving forest health. Next slide, please. CFMC and the Karuk tribe have started a family-led burn program to bring back this traditional way of burning. We help families burn around their homes and gathering areas from mid-October through April 31st. CAL FIRE doesn't require a permit or a burn plan during this period of time. We host community classes on safe burn practices, help people prep their land so the fire will stay inside the intended area, and bring our fire engine as standby on the day of the burn. More and more families are starting to use fire again. This is an elder that lives upslope of Highway 169, an area rated as very high fire risk by CAL FIRE. You might notice the firefighter in the background holding a hose and the smile on this elder's face as he lights the final patch of land on the slope behind his house. I can only imagine what a relief it is for him to have all that brush so close to his house and shop gone. Next slide. CFMC, in cooperation with the Yurok tribe wildland fire, assisted this elder to safeguard his home against the risk of wildfire. This photo was taken after the smoke died down. It doesn't show the fire line dug down to mineral soil at the top of the burn or the high pressure hose we laid along the fire line connected to a fire engine. You can see the hose along the bottom of the burn that we used to wet the ground next to his house. His home is about 5 feet away from this slope. The fire was started at the top of the burn unit inside the fire line, and it slowly backed its way down the hill. We used the hose to spray it a little to keep the flames low. Next slide. This picture is below his house. The fire backing its way down the hill to meet Highway 169. We reseeded the area around his home with native grass seed to crowd out the brush to further reduce the wildfire risk. The world is talking about how to reduce the impact of wildfire, and prescribed fire is coming to the fore as one of the primary strategies. Government agencies, tribes, NGOs, and private landowners are beginning to join forces to return good fire to the land. We recognize that prescribed fire can be used to reduce the spread and impact of wildfire, but liability is a huge challenge. Everyone is worried about liability. Access to appropriate insurance is a prohibitive factor in implementing prescribed burns. It's next to impossible to find an insurance company willing to provide coverage to organizations doing prescribed burns. I looked online for several months for an insurance company willing to give us liability insurance and followed up every recommendation from others to potential brokers, but to no avail. Finally, we had to ask the tribe to cover us under their insurance. Luckily, they said yes. Next slide. Organizations that specialize in prescribed fire and private landowners need to have access to appropriate insurance in order to use fire to protect homes and other assets from wildfire. Private landowners are constantly reaching out to the Cultural Fire Management Council, asking us to teach them how to safely burn their land. Fire must be returned to the hands of the people so they have the ability to protect their homes from wildfire and reap the benefits good fire provides. Next slide. Time has shown that government agencies cannot handle this wildfire problem alone. We need to call all hands on deck, including private landowners. Next slide. Give them access to affordable insurance, training, and support to use controlled burns as a means of reducing their wildfire risk. Non-governmental agencies that specialize in fire must also have access to appropriate insurance to enable them to conduct prescribed burn operations that limit the threat of catastrophic wildfire and improve forest health. I'm not sure who should be responsible to provide insurance options to enable prescribed burn operations, private sector insurance companies, or the state of California. I do know that it is a necessity. It would also be helpful if California had a gross negligence standard for prescribed fire liability. Thank you again for this opportunity to share information.
Thank you very much, Margot. I appreciate your contribution, and I will pull up the next presentation. Okay, thank you. Next, we will have Dr. Jeff Wachowski from the Center for Insurance Policy Research at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. Welcome, Jeff. I'll pull up your presentation.
Great, thank you, Mike. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So before I begin, I would just like to thank Commissioner Lara and also the Departments of Insurance in California, as well as Oregon, who have engaged with us on this work, as well as our research collaborators at RMS, IVHS, and the National Fire Protection Association with Firewise USA program. Next slide, please. So As Commissioner Lara was discussing at the beginning, as the underlying wildfire risk is increasing, this is becoming an issue of affordability and availability of insurance within the state. And as he's advocating for the use of home hardening is really sort of the ultimate solution here. And this is a recent article that I picked out and just wanted to highlight sort of a couple of things on home hardening, the metal roof, as well as the brush space around the home. That both of these components have really just been touched upon in the previous presentations. And the idea that we need to have more, to have better information around these mitigation measures, how they actually reduce risk and sort of the economics of that. And that was really our objective in doing this research. And we're approaching this from a CAP modeling perspective. Next slide. As an outcome of this work, we've put together two outputs. On the next slide, the first component of this has really been an educational document that we've put together for our members, for the regulators, that describes in a fair amount of detail the RMS wildfire model, which you're going to hear about more in a few minutes, and the different components of that. So first off, we wanted to have this educational understanding of how wildfire catastrophe models work. And then importantly, if you go to the next slide, we wanted to run the model for an application of wildfire mitigation to property. And what we've done here is we've tried to link in this research report, which is available there through that link at the bottom, the recommendations, some of which have already been discussed from IBHS and Firewise, and link that up to 3 communities in California, as well as 3 communities in Oregon, and also 3 communities in Colorado, and run the economics on that. If you could go to the next slide, please. And so the main takeaway from this is we do demonstrate that the home hardening economics can work. And importantly, this perspective is really just from a movement of risk-based premiums moving from a poorly built wildfire resistant structure to a well-built one. We started off by demonstrating what the underlying wildfire risk looks like. And you can see for 4 of the 6 communities that we modeled in California and Oregon, it was significant compared to existing premiums here for California, statewide, $1,600. The sort of neutral perspective of this risk is 20 to 30% of that rate. And then we demonstrate that we switched to this poorly built structure, and from moving from that to a well-built one, you're saving anywhere from $3,300 to $4,500 per year, depending upon the modeling that was happening. And I'll come back to those numbers in a few minutes. But basically, we compare that with the costs, and we show that it is economically effective to undertake these measures in some circumstances. Next slide, please. So as I was just describing, this is really the overall methodology for the work. We start off with this neutral setting where we're undertaking sort of the wildfire risk that's dependent upon, a lot of this is on the fuel type and the slope and the distance to vegetation, as a number of the speakers have already alluded to, and then contrasting that with the well-built and poorly built structure, as well as distance to vegetation. At the bottom there, you can see we look at a number of different things: roofs, vents, wall claddings, patios, and even some community characteristics. And the details of all of these are in that report. Next slide, please. And in California, the 3 communities that we ran the model on for this mitigation analysis were Upper Deerwood, which is on the red square on the map to the left, as well as Berry Creek, and then Orville. And these three communities represent sort of three different types of risk, basically around a lot of this around their fuel type and the underlying wildfire risk characteristics. So you can see with Upper Deerwood, this is a more heavily timber oriented type of community, and the associated red squares to the right of that reflect that on the underlying modeling that comes out of the community. These are significant losses per dollar of coverage. Berry Creek is the second community there is the red circle on the left. This was more between the heavily timber-oriented Upper Deerwood and more of an urban area of Orville. And then the last community is Orville, which is very close to that. And this is more of an urban suburban area and has more of a grass or brush type of fuel type embedded in that. Next slide, please. And we did run this model on Berry Creek over the summer prior to the tragic wildfire that did occur there in September. And so really, I think this really hits home in the fact that this is simply not just an academic exercise. We did run the model on this community. We are showing, in fact, that for communities such as Berry Creek that had this extensive damage that happened to it, that the economics of home hardening can work to help prevent that moving forward. Next slide, please. So these are some of the dollar numbers for the three communities. The red lines that are indicated here are again moving from, I'll take for example, the orange bar. This is a poorly built structure. And then the I guess, shaded green, olive green bar to the left of that. The difference between those two is this $3,300 savings moving from the poorly built structure to the well-built one. The red line on top of that indicates the additional savings with vegetation included around the perimeter of the home. Next slide. So the idea is we take those savings for the homes that, and at the community level, and we do it for individual homes and at the community and compare it to the costs. These are some costs from IBHS. And a few things to point out here in terms of these costs is you can see that they range, right? So for one, around roof, depending upon what the activity is, it's ranging from $10,000 to $25,000 in cost to redo your roof to make it more wildfire resistant. Creating a buffer on your home, the range here, $3,000 to $15,000. And it's important to highlight that there is a range of costs that are associated with that, and we account for this in the analysis. But also, I would like to point out that I would say many of these costs have probably not built in the economies of scale due to the amount of mitigation that is currently taking place. So I think you can imagine over the future that these costs would be able to be reduced as more and more of this would be happening. Next slide, please. But with that said, we used those costs and we ran through low, medium, and high cost scenarios. This is an example of the benefit cost calculation around a low cost scenario with a relatively short timeline of 10 years. So you might remember I had pointed out the $3,300 for the structural mitigation savings of moving from a poorly built structure to a well-built one. When you take that over 10 years and discount it back, you're getting a value of $31,000 in today's terms. You compare that to the cost of $20,000 to do that retrofit. The economics work out in terms of you're getting $1.57 back for every dollar that you're investing. Anything greater than one means it's economically efficient to achieve. And on the right-hand side, this is with the vegetation, and you can see that the BC ratio here is even more significant. Next slide, please. And in the report, we go through in detail for California as well as the other communities what these economics look like. The green shaded ones here, again, are all values that are greater than one for low, medium, and high cost scenarios for $20,000, $40,000 to $60,000 to $75,000 in cost, and over different timeframes and with different discount rates. And again, though, I think the main point is the economics do work. Next slide, please. But as you can see, it's not necessarily in every case. Mike, if you want, yeah, thank you. And so, although we feel like we've laid a really great foundation here for this, for this conversation and through this research effort, we definitely feel that there's more research that needs to be done. These were sort of examples that we used to walk through the analysis. They're not meant to say that this can happen every single time. It depends a lot on the information that's going into the model. And that's something that we would really like to work further on in targeted areas. So my final slide. I'd be happy to, again, the report is available for any of you that would like to access it, and I would certainly encourage you to do so. And I'm happy to also take any questions offline, and there's my email address, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Really appreciate the results and that you've shown, and appreciate your time in putting this together. I do want to note that the next two speakers also helped with this report and participated in this research project. And so this definitely was a very collaborative effort. And I appreciate all that interest in this topic and the economics of home hardening. So thank you, Jeff. Our next presenter is Michael Young from RMS. I will pull up the presentation as you get ready to present. Thank you for being here, Mr. Young.
That's great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. And yes, it was truly a pleasure to work with Dr. Kozowski on that mitigation benefit cost study, really. And my commentary today will go a little bit more about the model, talk a little bit about some of the science behind it at a high level, build on some of the commentary that Glenn Drashovic from KCC has made about these things. We're still waiting for the slides to come up. Perfect. And hopefully build some confidence that the complexity and the science that's behind some of these catastrophe models and why these are necessary tools in the insurance industry and the rate making process. So if you go to the next slide, this highlights the 4 key points that I want to make sure I leave with you today. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the nonlinear loss trends and about why CAP models are a solution to overcoming some of the limitations of historical loss data. And then I also want to emphasize some of the things about the wildfire CAP model technology framework, not just in RMS, but in many of the other solutions that are in the market today, are not new science, right? They are basically building on decades of research. We'll talk a little bit about the components of the RMS CAP model, and finally with some commentary about the mitigation study and some thoughts on kind of where to take that going forward and some advice that I've personally derived some of the work that I've done in developing mitigation studies in the state of Florida for hurricane risk. So if you go to the next slide, Mike. This slide here is designed to illustrate historical loss data for wildfires nationwide. Of course, California dominates a lot of this, but the one of the things I do to explain to most people who are new to this area or new to the insurance industry and say, well, why can't you just look at the 20-year historical average? Well, this graph illustrates the reason why that is not possible, and it's the hockey stick shaped nature of the curve that makes it very difficult for actuaries to kind of use this to extrapolate what the losses are going to be going forward. And the foundation principle associated with this is that the U.S. Forest Service is one of the primary ways of defending against wildfires, and their effectiveness is getting more and more stressed over time. In fact, they've recently admitted that they can really only deal with 98% of the fires that occur in nature and protect the areas. And 98% sounds like it's a really great statistic, but it's that last 2% that drives some of the biggest and largest losses that we've seen in the last 5 years. over time. Now, the drivers of why this loss curve looks the way it is partially founded in the same things that occur for hurricane and earthquake risk. We tend to build more homes. We have to build more homes. Populations are growing. When you build more homes, they're going to be in high risk areas and areas that can be impacted by wildfire and other natural perils. Climate change is also having an effect on certain areas of the state in California. Northern California in particular is having higher severity, not necessarily higher frequency, but higher severity than what we've seen in long-term historical averages. And then that commentary about the 98% of fires can be fought by the firefighting services is indicative of that buildup of fuel over time. And so all those combine together to create the perfect storm of what wildfires can do. Now, if we go to the next slide, this slide is designed to give a very brief synopsis about the history of wildfire risk modeling. The foundation principles actually go all the way back to the 1960s. The USDA, Department of Agriculture, developed a fire danger rating system based on vegetation classifications as far back as 1964, and they continued to improve that over the next 20 years or so, increasing the number of fuel models that they use to classify that risk as early as 1978. Fire spread modeling is based in a lot of the public domain literature on the work of Albini, and Anderson augmented that with a new improved fuel model in the late 80s. But really, some of the pivotal work that was done in the mid 2000s, early 2000s is founded on some of the work that was done through land fire and the National Fire Plan with a satellite-based derivation of fuel data layers coast to coast for the entire US. By collecting that data at the resolution that they did in the early 2000s, it enabled a comprehensive risk simulation methodology, which is commonly known as FSIM, developed by Mark Finney at the US Forest Service Lab in Rocky Mountain Research Lab in Missoula, Montana. That's the foundational principle that you'll find in a lot of the catastrophe models that are on the market today. But in addition to that, that was great for modeling where the fires go. But in fact, what we really need to do is figure out how to protect the individual buildings. And so I'm an engineer by training, and I tend to think of this in terms of a loads and resistance fact. And so we've seen growing evidence over the last 20 years, a lot of science done by IBHS and the University of California Cooperative Education System, like we've heard the previous speaker talk about. But how do you protect the individual buildings from fires that are impinging on them? So if you go to the next slide, just like Glenn Draskovic mentioned, the catastrophe modeling framework is an excellent way of kind of detangling some of the things that are all commingled together in the loss history and trying to figure out what really drives the risk. So the 5 foundational aspects of any catastrophe model are creating a series of hypothetical events, stochastic event catalogs. In the RMS model, what we do is we create 50,000 years worth of wildfires, or over 72 million fires nationwide that we've created. And for each one of those ignitions and events that are created, we create a heat, an ember, and a smoke footprint associated with that, using physically based scientific simulations in order to create realistic representations of how big and how large each of those different perils are for each of those events that could occur. And then you compare that to the insurance data or exposure data, you know, who's got what at risk. We then estimate damage through vulnerability modules and then allocate those losses to different financial aspects. Now, Mike, if we go to the next slide, we see here the 7 main components of the hazard modeling framework. And so a lot of the work that we do stands on the shoulders of the good work that was done in the mid to late 2000s in terms of that FSIM simulations for fire spread modeling. But we've come back and then repackaged the information so it can be used by our insurance company clients. And we start with the land fire data on the left-hand side, couple it with the 50,000 year simulations on the second component, combine it with fire ignition models that are forward-looking and based on urbanization patterns, because most wildfires are not caused by natural causes, lightning causes, but most wildfires are actually caused by human-related ignitions. And we do know a large part of that may be related to utility risk. And of course, the state is working very hard to try and bring that risk factor down within the state. But the 3 the 3 advances that we've made in our modeling framework are explicit ember simulations, explicit urban conflagration simulations, which is the structure-to-structure ignition mechanism, and explicit smoke simulations that we have built into the model so that insurance companies can get a full picture of all the losses that could occur. Now, if you go to the next slide, what that means is that, it's great to do all that simulation of the three main perils: smoke, embers, and heat intensity. But in reality, wildfire, unlike earthquakes and hurricanes, is what I call a hyper-local peril. It is something that you need a very fine granularity in order to assess the risk at a location-by-location basis. And the three extra factors that are super critical for doing that are figuring out what the topography is around individual buildings, how far the vegetation is to that building, and what that vegetation is. And so those items in green, the slope, flammable vegetation, and fuel type, are compiled in our model, but are a key element in the vulnerability framework in the next slide that can be overridden by individual users of our model, right? So this is setting up a framework so that insurance companies can actually facilitate some kind of an inspection program, reflect the fact that maybe individual properties have been mitigated by moving that vegetation out beyond the 5 foot or the zone zone that you hear about from IBHS and other people in this community. And then it's designed to work with the rest of a very robust secondary modifier framework. So we have hundreds of vulnerability curves based on the primary characteristics that insurance companies typically track: construction, occupancy, number of stories, and year built. And then a set of modifiers that are based on the foundational research at IBHS. RMS is proud to be a member of IBHS and sits on the research advisory board there. And so if you go to the next slide, Mike. The aspects, I'm not going to talk about what those different attributes are. They are covered in the report that Dr. Kozowski talked about prior to that. But the one thing I wanted to stress right now was that the data that we're seeing, even from the 2020 wildfires that have occurred in California, when you look at the DINS data collected by CAL FIRE, and that's plotted on the right-hand side here in terms of every single structure that was on or near the individual LNU complex near Vacaville in August of 2020. The blue crosses are the not damaged structures, and the black plus signs are the damaged structures. When you calculate the statistics here, almost 30 to 60% of the structures that are within the fire footprint actually survive the wildfire, right? So most people expect that a wildfire is this circle polygon that you have, and that's complete destruction within and nothing on the outside, because that's what we typically see in the media. So I want to leave the point here that we need to figure out how to increase that survivability metric beyond the 60%. And the attributes that are promoted in the mitigation programs from IBHS and the FireWise program at NFPA are a very key element of doing that on a structure by structure basis. And when we go to the next slide now, Mike. So just some additional commentary about that report. I want to re-emphasize that this was a preliminary study. We picked 3 locations at random. The Berry Creek location is noteworthy in that we happened to pick something that was affected months after we started doing the analysis here. So the loss reductions that are reported in this report are to give you a sense of what the potential is. But I want to definitely emphasize that this potential, although it looks like the same percentage in most communities, the magnitude will depend on the location-specific information. And so it's very important that when we allow insurance companies the flexibility to figure out how to promote mitigation, that we give them the right tools that are going to incentivize the right behavior. And so picking up on some learnings that I personally have had from designing mitigation programs in Florida, make sure we don't build into mitigation credit schemes things that homeowners can't change. Like, don't give people credit for street width. Build that into the base rating factors. Make sure that's part of the territory analysis, but don't make that part of a mitigation program, because what happens sometimes is that homeowners will get an inspection. They'll say, oh, look, I'm in a good neighborhood. I got a 30% credit. And then they stop looking at the other things that they really should do in order to move the needle. So that's the commentary that I would like to leave as you read that report. We're certainly happy to look at and answer any questions about that report afterwards or offline. And we look forward to working with the regulators and the insurance industry using our model. The last slide that I included here was just some key attributes about the model and a summary of the key differentiating factors. And with that, I'm done my commentary.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that, and thanks also for contributing to this report and being part of our meeting today. While I switch out the slides here, our next presenter is Roy Wright, President and CEO of the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety, which we commonly refer to as IBHS. And so, Roy, if you'll get prepped, I will pull up your slideshow. Thank you.
Beautiful. I appreciate that. And as you pull those pieces up and hit present, I will say thank you to Commissioner Lara for convening us all today. I'm going to try to take the baton from a number of people, Yana Velikovich, Kelsey, some comments from RMS, and a couple others will come up and address some of these pieces here pretty quickly. I'm not seeing the slides up yet, but are they there yet, Mike? There we go. And if you click to the next slide. Now, Californians really do get the ember piece. We don't always see this in other parts of the United States. Yet their imagination really is too small. They may know that it happens nearby, but we see how these embers loft a half mile, a mile or more. And there's some really good solutions about the urban interface where you can look at 0 to 5, 5 to 30, 30 to 100. And they're proven tactics that work in these more rural areas that we see here. But there's a shift that has to happen as we look at the suburban space. When you can see your neighbor's porch from your front porch, it's different because 30 feet out, you're in your neighbor's kitchen. 100 feet out, there could be 3 to 5 homes in a place. And that's where the configuration really begins to kick in. Michael, click to the next one. You know, wildfires are not new to us, yet people, their buildings, and their affinity for natural spaces, it continues to increase the wildfire risk to the built environment. So despite our efforts to reduce that threat, climate change is intensifying that threat. At this point, simply looking back might be interesting, but it's not relevant. You know, 85% of Californians live in that suburban or urban context. And so some of this is common sense, but some of it's not. So when our researchers go to work, we look at 8 different streams and look at these elements that play out related to fuel management, fences and decks and building shape, walls, roofs, roof vents, eave overhangs, and there's a lot of gradation to this, and much of it is overwhelming. And so we've been working with our science to find a digestible view that looks at the interdependent parts in some rational groupings. I don't want to oversimplify this. It's not as if you can take this in a pure sequential way. Yet we have tried to take the interdependent parts and put them in a way that allows a homeowner or any other kind of policymaker or insured to understand where to start with that conversation, how you then build on that to keep going and level up, and then some things that are last mile, particularly things that from a price point or the fact you could only do them at the point of new construction. We'll click to the next slide. So in that start here, we'll start with roofs. I'll be really plain on this. The vast majority of Californians have a Class A roof. And so while there's a big price tag on that, most have met that mark already, but not all of them. And in that small percentage of places where they have a highly flammable roof or something that isn't all the way to Class A, this is problematic. We think about the 0 to 5 home ignition zone. There's a lot of discussion about this first 5 feet up against the structure. It's not saying nothing can be there. There's some ornamental vegetation and the like that is resistant to wildfire that might be appropriate, but this is a flip. You know, this is not about putting hedges next to homes. It's about pushing those elements out. But I look at these pieces related to those vents that get to attics. Because when our team joined CAL FIRE and others and looked at the glass fire just earlier this year, there's a striking number of fires that began in the attic, right? So the tree canopy may have actually caught fire, and then those embers continued to come. And so you would see that there would be fire suppression crews that arrive, and you would see the first floor of the house remaining, but the entire second floor had been enveloped in flames. Here's the great irony. Those vent covers for the entire house may only cost $200. We keep going. We think about fences, back-to-back fences. You know, that becomes a place where really the intensity of fire can be fanned up because of organic debris that fits between there. We also think then about how those fences turn to gates. You can make it so there's literally a wick that is coming up to your home, right? You've got to cut that off. And so you don't want wood or plastic, but something that's non-flammable. Again, a few $100s changes that piece of the equation. Think about trees. You know, the tree canopy, frankly, we try to foster is a counterbalance to other dimensions of climate change. Yet that tree canopy at that 20 or 30 feet can become a place that harbors those embers and then catch fire and keep those ember pieces going. And your yard debris, it's got to start with you. But then there's some really hard conversations that play out about the debris that may be there on your neighbor's property. Again, these building blocks from the starting here to keep it going, how do we look down those items? We next go to level up. This is another after action piece that we've seen in the field. Are outbuildings like sheds, dog houses, or wooden playgrounds are really problematic. You may have a home that's covered in stucco, and so you're actually in pretty good shape on that front. But then you've got a plywood shed that was delivered by a big box store that's just back behind your house. Embers get there, or let alone a flame, it hits there, and then it fans pieces up. And finally, we go the last mile down these pieces. There are things, you really need to be at multi-pane windows. Those things, though, begin to cost bigger amounts of money, and how you would extend that home ignition zone. I take you through these quickly. Our reports will show these elements. If you'll click me to the next slide, please. We have posted a set of reports for policymakers. I have gone through the elements on those suburban wildfire adaptation roadmaps just at about 30,000 feet, but all 8 of those lanes that I described, 40+ page report. And it goes through like in a network diagram way from marginal, good, better, best, right? We can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We've looked at the things of how we've seen the direct pieces from the 2017 and 18 fires play in here. Some important work on the codes. California leads the way. Many other states continue to follow. But we see that the standards have to meet that, because sometimes there are things that are allowed under Chapter 7A that still allow fire. They're better than nothing, but they're not good enough. And again, Chapter 7A is really too narrowly applied in the state. But I want to leave you with this, because all too often we start to hear a conversation that goes, well, yes, there's a landscape ecosystem piece that needs to play. And then there's an element related to the neighborhood. And then we can get to the structure. This need not be a debate about who goes first. We need wildfire mitigation at all three of those circles, all of them need to take shape. Let's not point fingers going, well, the neighborhood needs to go first, or they need to deal with the forest management first, or we need the whole set of neighbors to go. No, we each need to take those roles. And we need to drive people, yes, towards what's affordable and available to them, and then keep nudging people to take the right actions to minimize this risk. We appreciate the opportunity to continue to contribute to this effort there in California. We're deeply committed to it. Our research will continue, even looking at structured spacing and other kinds of elements in the neighborhood this next year, and we'll continue to feed that into the policymaking process here in California. With that, Mike, thank you very much.
And thank you to you, Roy. I really appreciate the presentation and also just the amount of effort that goes into all of these reports in terms of research and analysis. So thank you for being here and contributing. While I set up the next presentation, I'll introduce our speaker. We have next Brandy Andrews from AIR Worldwide, who's a vice president there and will speaking to us about catastrophe models. Brandy, welcome, and please, feel free to get yourself set up as I pull up your presentation.
Thanks, Mike. Can everybody hear me? All right. Just waiting for the slides. So I'll start with, my name is Brandy Andrews. I'm a vice president with AIR Worldwide. Thank you, Commissioner Lara, for inviting us to this hearing today. So you asked us all two specific questions, use of CAT models in rate making, and then using mitigation to help homeowners get greater access to insurance. So I'll be focusing just on the science aspect of our wildfire catastrophe model, because that's what we bring to the table. Next slide. For those of you who don't know us, AIR Worldwide is a catastrophe risk modeler. We create models for most of the different natural catastrophe perils and some of the man-made catastrophe perils that insured risks are exposed to around the world. This includes winds, storms, floods, fires, pandemics, and cyber attacks. Our core clients are in the insurance and reinsurance industry, but also include public entities, governments, and other businesses. Next slide. As an organization, AIR prioritizes the scientific underpinnings of catastrophe modeling. Most of our models are physically based, which means they're not just a combination of statistical distributions, but instead use the computational power of computers to simulate reality before, during, and after disasters. We have a group of about 10 people on our wildfire modeling team, and their backgrounds span forest fire modeling, ecology, meteorology, climate change, engineering, and other relevant disciplines. So our models are built by scientists and engineers to present a physically based, data-driven, objective view of the risk. Next slide. Most of our models, including the US wildfire model, use this fundamental framework that you see here. The framework is comprised of 3 modules that work together to estimate the catastrophe losses: the hazard, the engineering, and the financial modules. We first build a large catalog of event simulations. Our catalog is 100,000 simulation years and around 6.6 million different fire cluster events. These are physically realistic wildfire events that could occur. When the insurer tells the model information about its insured exposures, things like the address, what it's built of, the construction type, whether there's defensible space, things like that, the model will run simulations for each fire and estimate the fire's intensity at each insured structure. To calculate the damage for the different structures, we use engineering principles that are embedded in the model. And information about insurance policy conditions and the mitigation features that get entered inform the building's likelihood to burn in the fire simulation and the severity of loss for the structure. The last step in the modeling is to reflect insurance terms that are present on the insurance policies and calculate the insured payout. Next slide. To create the catalog of simulated events, we need to first define the wildfire hazard. The first step is to determine where these simulated fires will occur. That's the ignition locations. Since most fires occur in and around where people live, it's important to understand the locations of the wildland-urban interface, where towns are, and the road networks. Since weather and growing patterns are also important to localized fire risk, we need to understand the density of the fuels on the ground too. The likelihood of the fuels to burn in a simulated fire will depend on a number of factors, including weather conditions at the time of the simulated fire, as well as conditions about the burnable fuels in the period leading up to the fire. For example, if you have years of drought or years with a lot of precipitation, those conditions are considered in determining the likelihood to burn. The result of this is that the catalog has ignition locations that are consistent with the historical record and also how the fuels have evolved over time. Next slide. When the model runs, it goes through each simulated year and wildfire event in turn and uses scientifically based wildfire spread equations to model the fires in space and time. Starting with the ignition grid point, every time step evaluates a large number of variables that are present within a 90 by 90 meter grid cell and propagates the fire spread using this information. So you can see some of those data layers in the upper left of the slide. The slope of the land, its aspect relative to prevailing winds, information about the forest canopy and things like that. The end results are very realistic simulated wildfires, as you can see on the right hand in the map. This is the picture of a simulated fire after it ignited in one of the 90 meter grid cells on the east side and spreads a great distance to the west and southwest over the simulation. The different shades of yellow and orange show the speed and intensity of the fire across time and the impact of slope and topography. Next slide. The fire spread model explicitly accounts for all the ways a fire can spread on the surface of the ground, which is the left-hand image, the transition from the ground up to the canopy and then canopy spread, which is the middle image. And then when the fire produces spotting and firebrands that other speakers have talked about, which can jump ahead of the fire line and ignite new areas. Next slide. Our model recognizes the changes in type and the presence of burnable fuels at a fine scale. It also is important for a model to recognize that fires will respond to suppression efforts. As we know, firefighting efforts are focused on preserving life and property, so the model considers these factors when determining where the fire will spread in the simulation. So we don't just allow these fires to burn out of control, but explicitly recognize the areas where there will be containment efforts in place. Here's an example in San Diego County. In this close-up, you can see on the left, one of the model's simulated fire perimeters near the town of Rancho Bernardo. The fact that you have a portion of the city spared illustrates the model's ability to account for suppression efforts. You can also see the little red dots in the fire perimeter. This is where the simulation has generated those firebrands some distance away from the front of the fire. Next slide. One of the most important benefits of the model and the modeling framework that a lot of the other speakers have touched on is that you can account for mitigation features that homeowners have done to their properties. As I mentioned before, engineering principles in the model get used to estimate damages from the simulated fires that impact each insured structure. These damage functions that get used in the analysis respond to the insurer's risks based on different construction features and the presence of specific mitigation efforts. So if you tell the model about the mitigation efforts, it picks the right set of damage functions to use for each structure. We often talk about mitigation features, but at AIR, we sometimes use the term building risk characteristics instead. The fact is that some characteristics make the building less susceptible to fire, for example, maintaining the defensible space, but some make it more susceptible to fires, like having wood roof shingles instead of clay tiles. We currently capture these 5 different categories of mitigation features or building risk characteristics in our model. And each of these different categories have several options within them. So we capture the type of roof, the type of siding, the presence of a skylight or a dormer or other feature on the roof that allows, some leaves to collect and could ignite the fire if the brand comes flying in, for example. Defensible space, and if the community participates in the FireWise program. So the modeling framework supports adding more mitigation features to the model over time, assuming we can get the right data and insurance claims data, and things like that. Next slide. So just to sum everything up, the catastrophe models provide a very logical, objective framework to assess wildfire risk. AIR publishes about a 150-page technical document on our model that we provide to different stakeholders to help build comfort with the methods used to model this risk. Our engineers and scientists often conduct post-event field surveys to learn about how structures behaved in recent fires and how our model performs. We also engage with our clients and the scientific and firefighting communities and other organizations like the IBHS to support better understanding of this peril. Over time, the learnings that we all learn can be brought into the model, maybe in the form of additional or more refined mitigation features. We really see it as an iterative and collaborative process. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. While our next presenter gets ready, I just want to ask you one quick follow-up question, and that is, as you're sort of adapting these models to recent events, how do you integrate recent fires into your models moving forward?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. That's a really good question. So immediately after a fire, observational data is really powerful. We send a field team after major fires to conduct damage surveys, and we can observe real damage to structures. We also compare these learnings to the model estimates. So that's one key way that we learn from recent fires. But to a scientist or an engineer, observational data is kind of just the beginning of the journey. Over time, agencies will release reports about the fires that have happened in the past, and the scientific community will publish papers about studies they've done. So we gather all this information and study it to test the existing relationships in our model or to implement new ones. And it can take quite a long time, not only for the studies to be conducted, but for our scientists to evaluate them against the model. Just to give you a real quick example, one piece of information we used in a recent update of our wildfire model was a 100-page study from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a division of the US Department of Commerce. They published it in 2013, but they looked in detail at the Witch Fire, which happened way back in 2007. And they studied the effectiveness of different mitigation efforts on structural ignitions. And so the findings in studies like these are usually not totally conclusive either, but reflect the wide variation you always see in actual events in real life. So they take some time and effort to really understand and bring on board.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll appreciate your presentation, and I'll invite our next speaker, who will be Nancy Watkins, who's a principal and consulting actuary at Milliman Incorporated. Nancy, when you're ready, please go ahead and share your screen.
Hold on, everybody. I'm taking over your Zoom. All right. Thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. I am Nancy Watkins. My group in San Francisco does a lot of research and volunteer educational work for regulators, communities, and industries on issues of property insurance availability and affordability. So today I'd like to share my views on how we got into this crisis and how CAP models are a crucial part of a strategy to get out of it. Currently, California requires insurers in a homeowner's rate filing to replace all historical catastrophe losses with a long-term average. In practice, this methodology takes the last 20 years of insured losses from catastrophe events as a ratio to insured losses from other types of claims. This is an extremely simple rate-making model that represented the best available science many years ago. The California methodology could be actuarially sound if the cat risk is fairly consistent. You'd see the whole range of outcomes over 20 years of insured losses, and if there was a predictable relationship between catastrophic claims like wildfires or hailstorms and typical homeowners claims like water leaks, dog bites, and kitchen fires. But in reality, wildfire risk in California fails many of these conditions. We know that wildfire risk has increased significantly over the past 20 years due to factors like housing growth in high-risk areas and climate change. Prior to 2017, those forces would not have been necessarily visible by just looking at historical insured losses. As an illustration of how the California formula handles this, I'm showing actual data taken from the rate filings of 3 of the top 10 homeowners insurers added together. When you look at the 20 years of data through 2016, the formula shows that the load indicated for catastrophes is about 11% of non-cat losses. Add in the 2017 year and the cat load increases to 23%, 109% rate increase, mostly attributable to wildfire. Add in the 2018 year and the cat load increases to 53%, another 130% rate increase due to wildfire. So in 2 years, the California formula indicated that these insurers should increase catastrophe premiums by an average of almost 400%, or about 38% in overall premium. I don't believe that the wildfire risk for these companies increased 5-fold in 2 years, and I don't expect any fire scientists would measure risk this way. But the California formula sets the rules for how companies determine actuarially sound catastrophe rates. The formula looks backwards at insured losses when we need to be looking at what's affecting wildfire risk right now. It's kind of like expecting the Rocky Mountains to be flat because we just drove through Kansas and Missouri. Now the formula has finally begun to see the current risk, resulting in huge rate increases for many homeowners and creating an affordability crisis. Insurers' uncertainty about the ability to charge actuarially sound premiums has led to an availability crisis in some areas. So a huge risk of sticking with the status quo is the inability to move forward. An alternative to the California formula would be to allow insurers to use CAP models in their determination of how much premium to charge for their wildfire risk. Catastrophe models have been in use by insurers since the mid-1990s to understand and measure the risk of infrequent large event, and are considered to be the best available science for this purpose. So how would consumers benefit if insurers were allowed to use CAP models to calculate actuarially sound rates? First, I'd expect an immediate improvement in insurance availability in high-risk areas. Insurers are reluctant to provide coverage for risks that they can't reliably measure. In California for earthquake, and in other states for perils like hurricane and flood, we've seen lots of situations where a risk was formerly considered uninsurable, but where the adoption of catastrophe models has had dramatic and long-lasting improvements in insurance availability. Next, over the longer term, I'd expect a number of improvements in premium affordability. Increased availability means more competition. Different companies have different views and appetites for risk, so more competition will lead to expanded options for affordable coverage. CAT models would generally create more stable estimates of losses from year to year compared to the estimates using the 20-year average. Thus, using them to set premium levels would increase affordability by enabling homeowners to better anticipate their total cost of ownership before making a home buying decision. Then, if insurers were able to start with actuarially sound rates, many of them would be willing to offer mitigation discounts, incentivizing homeowners and communities to reduce their risk. This would reduce premiums while preserving availability. Finally, matching price to risk would discourage future home building in high-risk areas and reduce the number of new homes subject to high-cost insurance, reduce the number of lives at risk from wildfire, and decrease the cost of wildfire defense in the state. There are other potential benefits as well. Protecting insurer solvency by allowing them to better manage the risk aggregation, and aiding transparency through better understanding of wildfire risk factors and therefore premiums. Some of the examples from Jeff's presentation, distance to vegetation in the rate plan, those are the kinds of things you might be able to see with models. We could also put California on a path to plan for future changes in risk and affordability due to climate change. One of the biggest objections to implementing CAT models has been that they will result in higher premiums. This is not necessarily true, especially when the status quo is a formula that has already generated enormous rate increases based on recent years of experience. It's likely that this formula would continue to indicate that rates should be high for many years to come, even if wildfire mitigation actions were to significantly reduce wildfire risk. CAT models could respond much more quickly. In other markets, we've seen CAT models indicating lower premiums than experience-based formulas. For example, in North Carolina, we created a flood rating plan using a CAT model and including a reinsurance load, but it still resulted in flood premiums lower than the NFIP for about 94% of homes in the state. Another objection arises because different models give different answers. This doesn't mean the models are wrong. Models are like maps. They're simplified representations of the real world, and they don't all focus on the same things. Wildfire is inherently very complex, and the most important drivers of risk can be portrayed in many different ways. This variety of views actually creates more options for affordability through differential risk pricing. Models do tend to evolve and converge over time, as we've already seen with US hurricane models. Another objection is that these models are somehow black boxes that can be manipulated by insurers. This is not true. Just like other proprietary insurance algorithms, the CAT modelers wouldn't release their code to the public. However, as long as their IP is protected, modelers have demonstrated their willingness to explain to regulators what is inside the black box. And for the public, they would provide a lot of information on the most important risk factors are, as you've seen from prior speakers today. Finally, we hear the concern that by allowing CAT models, regulators are somehow losing their ability to protect consumers. CAT models are generally accepted as the basis for insurance rate making for catastrophic perils in most states, including California earthquake, and have not resulted in a Wild West situation anywhere else. Many state regulators hire experts to assess the suitability of catastrophe models for the purpose of rate making and routinely rely on the expert views in the course of successfully fulfilling their regulatory duties. If CDI wanted, it could choose to band with other states to create a clearinghouse for expert model reviews. On the last point, it's important to understand how out of step California is with the rest of the country. There are only 2 other states that technically disallow CAT models for homeowners rate making, and many regulators are moving towards lowering the barriers to model acceptance because they understand how important they are to addressing high-risk, underserved markets like California. In practice, the CDI does not require California's experience formula for earthquake and fire following earthquake, and commonly accepts CAT models for those purposes. So if CAT models can be regulated acceptably for earthquake in California, it's reasonable to expect that the same holds true for wildfire. Further, there are other entities like FEMA, real estate investors, and rating agencies that routinely use models to evaluate catastrophe risk, especially important in the context of climate change. We've experienced 13 of the 20 most destructive fires in California history since 2017, 6 of which occurred in 2020. We've left the familiar road of climate stability and are headed on our journey into rough terrain and wilderness ahead. It's tempting to pretend that the worst is behind us, that we can somehow put the wheels back onto our old simple formula, climb back in, and keep going. But that's a risky strategy that will put California on the wrong side of science, looking backwards. We need to look forward. We need to use the best tools available to us. California has always led the way with science and innovation. Let science and innovation lead us once more. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We really appreciate your presentation, and thank you for that. We next are going to transition to another actuary, Alan Schwartz, who is from AIS Consultants, who will be presenting, and there won't be a PowerPoint for this one. So just as the audience, please just expect the video feed. Thank you very much. Welcome, Alan. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and good morning or good afternoon to people, depending on where you are. I'm an actuary. I've been practicing as an actuary for about 40 years, more than 40 years, and I've been involved with California for over 20 years now. The clients I have are across a range. They include regulators, insurance companies, and public interest groups. So I'm going to talk about the 2 questions that came up in regard to this hearing from an actuarial perspective. And those 2 questions are, how, if at all, would the use of catastrophe modeling in rate making impact affordability and availability for homeowners insurance? And also the impact of wildfire mitigation for homeowners insurance. So I'm going to talk about the first issue first, because in a way that's somewhat simpler, and a lot of people have already talked about that. I would say it's very common in the insurance industry to have credits for policyholders who mitigate their losses or attempt to mitigate their losses, or take steps to mitigate losses. In private passenger auto, there's a fact if you're driving safety record. So if you're a safer driver, you get lower premiums. For workers' comp, there's experience rating. Homeowners insurance has burglar and fire alarm credits. And also, with regard to catastrophes for homeowners insurance, in hurricane-prone states, there are credits for mitigation to reduce the risk of hurricanes. The use of mitigation credits is consistent with applicable actuarial standards of practice. There's an actuarial standard of practice, number 12, dealing with risk classification. And in essence, mitigation credits are a risk classification factor. It's saying if you fall into that category, we're going to impact your premium. And various characteristics of an applicable risk classification factor is that there's a relationship between the risk characteristic and expected outcomes. And that applies for mitigation, where if you're applying a mitigation effort, you expect to have lower losses. The next characteristic is causality. And again, mitigation would fall within that. You would expect a mitigation effort to reduce losses. And so that's causing a reduction in the exposure to loss. Objectivity, it's ability to objectively analyze sorry about that, the ability to objectively analyze the mitigations that are applied and practicality. And that would also be applicable to mitigation. So I'd say wildfire mitigation and credits to policyholders are consistent with the actual standard of practice. Then once you decide you're going to have wildfire mitigation categories, you need to determine how much the credit should be. Say a common way of determining mitigation credits for insurance is based upon actual experience. To the extent there is not actual experience, it's common to use informed judgment to determine mitigation credits, and that could be adjusted over time as actual experience became available. So in summary, the use of mitigation credits is consistent with actuarial standards of practice. It's consistent with insurance industry practices, and it's beneficial for both policyholders and insurance companies. Now I'm going to go on to the second question, or really the first, was the impact of catastrophe modeling on affordability and availability. Right now, the department's regulations, there's one regulation dealing with catastrophes for earthquake and fire following earthquake, where models are allowed subject to certain conditions. It's not any model is allowed. The department has a specific regulation saying what those models have to do. And then there's a catastrophe provision for other types of losses, which is 10 CCR 2644.5. And there was some mention about it being a 20-year period. The regulation actually indicates it's at least 20 years. So spreading out unusual losses like there have been in recent years over a longer time period would reduce the impact of the recent wildfires on the indicated losses. And the current regulation also allows for an adjustment based on the mix of business. So to the extent that insurance companies are having a change in the mix of business, which is changing their catastrophic exposure over time, the current regulation allows companies to make an adjustment for that and submit it in their rate filing and try and get approval for that if their exposure to the catastrophes is really changing because of their mix of business. In terms of the overall rate level, the difference between the impact based on the current regulation for wildfires, which is based on historical data and a computer model, in an abstract theoretical sense, you can't say whether one is going to give a higher answer than the other. It's a fact-specific situation. However, from a practical, realistic perspective, given the push of the insurance industry to implement the computer models, I think it's very reasonable to believe that that's going to result in higher indicated premiums. And that's what's happened in other cases, like when hurricane modeling or earthquake modeling was implemented, the indications were for significant increases in premiums. Now, an increase in premium may make the insurance more available in the sense that insurance companies are willing to sell it if they're getting a higher price. But if the price becomes so high, the fact that insurance companies are willing to sell it may not really make it available to policyholders if it becomes unaffordable. The current regulation for the department for wildfires, catastrophes, is consistent with actuarial standards of practice. Actuarial standard of practice number 39 deals with the treatment of catastrophe losses and property casualty insurance rate making. And that allows for the use of historical data and indicates that if historical data, for some reason, is not giving the exact right answers or some issue with it, it allows for other things, including the use of non-insurance data or possibly models. or a mix of those. So the department's current regulation in terms of how they deal with wildfire catastrophes is consistent with actuarial standards of practice. Now, as I said before, the current regulation for catastrophes by the insurance department has some requirements for what those models have to do. They have to meet all the standards of practice or actuarial standards of practice set forth by the Actuarial Standards Board. They have to have the best information regarding frequency, severity, damage, and loss. And they have to meet all applicable statutory standards. And all three of those relate to actuarial issues. With regard to the third one about the applicable statutory standards, that's an issue in regard to, or there's an issue in regard to disclosure in terms of what information is made available and how transparent things should be. And there's also an actuarial standards of practice dealing with that. Actuarial communications, which indicates a level of disclosure. So there's an actuarial standard of practice dealing with catastrophe models and how to evaluate them. It's actuarial standard practice number 38. And in that, there's broad categories that actuaries have to look at when they evaluate these computer models. And one of them deals with how the results from different models compare to each other. And I think the speaker before indicated that you don't expect the models to give the exact same result because each model is based on different assumptions and different parameters and different inputs. But it's not unreasonable to expect those models are going to give answers within a reasonable range of results. And what we've seen for models in California is that often two different models give dramatically different results, wildly different results. There are filings in recent years for homeowners insurance which have included a provision for fire, following earthquake based on models. And in one filing by a significant insurer with over $100 million in premium, the variation from one model to the next was a difference of 150%. That is, one model was giving an answer 2.5 times as large as the other model. And there was another filing that I've looked at where an even larger insurer with over $400 million in homeowners insurance premiums. And in that case, there were models that gave answers 3 times or more than 3 times as large as a different model. So I think when the models are giving answers that divergent from each other, there are questions about whether those models are giving accurate results and accurate projections, and whether policyholders should be paying rates based on models that appear not to really be that accurate in terms of able to being able to project what the losses are. I'd say models have been around for more than 20 years. They first came into effect for hurricanes. And even though the hurricane models have been around for a long time, there are still issues of dispute with regard to how accurate those models are and the inputs to those models and the output of those models. I've been involved in rate making in North Carolina, and I know the insurance commissioner in that state has had issues with the hurricane models used by the rating bureau in that state, and has over time determined that there are aspects of those models which likely overstate the amount of hurricane losses. So just because a model has been around for a long time doesn't mean there isn't any disagreement about those models. I've been going on for a while, so I just want to say in summary that I think it's reasonable to say, how could rate making be improved? And to be able to say, we're willing to consider changes to the rate making procedures that could have a beneficial impact to all the stakeholders involved, including policyholders and insurance companies, and that give more accurate results. But I think the burden of proof should fall upon those parties who are proposing a change in the rate making methodology. And they should need to show that the method that they're proposing to use is accurate and reliable and is fully transparent, so that everyone affected by that model will know the reasons for why they're being impacted and why their premiums are being impacted. Anyway, thank you. And those are the end of my comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartz. We appreciate it. And thank you for your comments and presentation. Our next speaker is Chief Daniel Berlant, who's Assistant Deputy Director at CAL FIRE. And so if he's ready, I would welcome Chief Berlant, who will be starting just speaking with video, and we'll have a presentation that will come up a bit later in his comments. Chief Berlant, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for joining us. This is such an important topic, especially as the effects of climate change, overgrown forests, and even prolonged drought that's really resulted in unprecedented tree mortality across the state, as well as the fact that we've just had an increase in the number of fires, the size of fires, severity of wildfires. This is obviously a very timely discussion. You know, it seems like every year now we are breaking records for the size and even the destruction of wildfires. In 2007, the fire siege down in San Diego and Southern California destroyed over 3,000 structures. That prompted a number of changes related to our building codes, which I'll get into a minute. But it really, even though it was just over a decade ago, has well been surpassed in the record books. The very next year, 2008, we had a lightning siege in Northern California, destroying over 8,400 structures all across Northern California. And then here just recently, the North Bay fires destroyed over 8,900 structures. And then that was dwarfed in 2018 by the Camp Fire in Paradise Butte County, nearly 19,000 structures. So just significant structure loss in just the past couple of years, but this trend that we've been on for over a decade now. I want to mention a couple of the statistics that we've been tracking. After every wildfire, we collect data on the damage. We look at that damage inspection data, and we've started to really analyze it and see what it's telling us. And looking back at the Camp Fire in 2018, for homes that we inspected, where we went out and actually inspected for compliance for defensible space, if a home was non-compliant, they were 5 times more likely to be destroyed in that fire. And so that is a stat that tells us defensible space works. Another stat, though, if a fire catches, if the home, catches fire, it has a over 93% chance that it's going to be completely destroyed. So making sure that these homes don't ignite in the first place is critical. Defensible space in itself keeps fire away from the home, keeps radiant heat away from the home. But as we've learned, especially over this past decade, it's embers that sometimes travel a mile ahead of the fire. It's these embers that rain down on the communities that really result in the structured numbers that we're seeing. And so homes that were built to our wildland building codes, we call them Chapter 7A, which is the section of the building code that looks at the wildland urban interface areas or the very high fire hazard severity areas. Homes that are built to this Chapter 7A standard have a much higher percentage of survival. Talk about those building codes in just a moment. Probably for all of you watching, understand that California's dry Mediterranean climate lends itself just naturally to wildfires, as it has for centuries. And while we've taken a lot of extra steps, especially in this past several years, to prevent and suppress human-caused fires, we also have to learn to adapt to wildfires. Adapting to wildfires is a systematic approach. There's no one solution. Home hardening is an important element of it, but it's not the only piece. It really has to be this all of the above theory. So it means planning communities that are hardened against wildfires, making sure we have fuel breaks around communities, ensuring that our forests are healthy. But it also includes building homes out of ember-resistant building materials in this notion of home hardening, in combination with maintaining 100 feet of defensible space. Defensible space, of course, meaning the removal of dead or overgrown vegetation. In the wildland areas where CAL FIRE, where we protect, that the law requires 100 feet of defensible space. Many homeowners, though, may not have 100 feet around their home. They may live in a subdivision themselves. And so up to the property line, just removing any dead grass, brush, leaves, pine needles, any accumulation on the roofs, these are all components of defensible space. Now, for decades, we've really focused on the residents' responsibility to maintain that defensible space work. But what we're really seeing, as I mentioned, that combination between defensible space and hardening the homes, that's what really increases the home's chance of surviving. So following the 2007 San Diego fires that I mentioned early on, that really kind of started this record-breaking trend, the Office of the State Fire Marshal under CAL FIRE, as well as a number of stakeholders and partners, worked to establish a new building code standard for homes that are in the wildland urban interface areas. So we do have a standard here in California, and at the time, and I would even argue still, we have some of the most stringent building code requirements for wildland areas, anywhere in the nation. Now, internationally and even nationally, that our code has been modeled. But even since 2008, we've continued to modify the building codes. We've continued to incorporate the best available products and building techniques to strengthen that building code. Some of the recent additions to the building code include UL-listed garage door weather stripping. So we found that members were able to find the openings in the garage doors. And so by putting this UL-listed weather stripping around it, it closes out that gap between the home and the garage door itself. Screens over skylights is a new addition as well. Mike, if you want to go ahead and we'll start the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to breeze through this fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through it in complete detail, but as you can see on this screen, one of the things that we recently launched was a low-cost retrofit list. You can move to the next slide. The low-cost retrofit list really looks at taking these building standards that are in Chapter 7A and helping identify the easy, low-cost items that a homeowner who has a home that was built before the codes can do to their home. You can see this is the list on the right-hand side. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to, again, go through these fairly quickly. You can find these all on our website. What we have found, though, in our research is that the #1 retrofit that can be done is replacing the roof. Making sure that it's a fire-resistant Class A roof material is by far the best investment. However, it in itself is not low cost. It can range from in prices, but it's not a low-cost item by itself. However, roofs don't last forever, and so we are starting to see that many of the older homes built pre-2008, people are starting to remodel their homes or update their roofing, and so making sure that you're using a Class A roof material, has composite shingles, is used with concrete or clay, even metal materials that again are not going to ignite. Are very important. So again, low-cost item here is when you're going to replace the roof, make sure you're using a Class A roof material. We'll go to the next slide. Next item on here is blocking any spaces in the roof. These can often be called bird stops. You can see on the right-hand side the tile roof, very popular construction in Southern California. But underneath that tile, easily embers can get in there and get the wood material that go under the roofing itself. A new standard we're looking at is actually providing a fire-resistant sheathing that will go under the roof tile itself, but above the construction. But just closing the roof, these openings in the coverings is a relatively easy and low-cost item. We can go to the next slide. Third here is installing combustible metal gutters, making sure that any leaves, pine needles don't get into the gutters. It still requires you to get up on your rooftop if you have trees that send leaves over, so you still need to provide the maintenance, but this is an easy way that it just ensures that you don't have as much accumulation as you can see from this photo. These gutter guards are easily purchased at any hardware store. We're good. Next slide. Next item on here is covering the chimney or stovepipe outlets. Again, just trying to have a very small opening so that the heat can escape, but that embers, large embers, aren't able to get inside the chimney. And in this case, we obviously don't want items to come out of the chimney as well. And so this one works to keep the hot stuff inside, but also in what you'll see as we even move on to the next slide here, the metal meshing screens are popular throughout the house and very easy home improvements that anybody can do. You don't need a contractor. Covering all vent openings with a 1/16 inch to 1/8 inch non-combustible, that's the key here, metal mesh. Again, we're trying to keep those embers out of these open spaces where you want good ventilation for heating purposes and cooling purposes, but we don't want those embers to get in there. We can go to the next slide. Caulking any or plugging any gaps that are larger than 1/16 inch. Wood is imperfect. If the home is made of wood, or you have any exterior that is made of what could be at the right or a combustible material, you want to close any of those gaps so that those embers can't find kind of the chink in the armor, if you will. We can go to the next slide. And very easy to do on a weekend. Look for any dry rot, any gaps, just normal maintenance. But all of these here from these photos are just going to be key places that embers are going to find, and then they're able to get inside to some of the more combustible of the items within your home. And so by closing those out, replacing damaged boards, it makes sure that your home's not only maintained, but again, it increases that armor, if you will. Go to number 8, please. Installing weather stripping. I mentioned this before. Many garages have an opening. You can even see very slightly in this picture above and below, the sunlight creeping in. If the sunlight can creep in, ember under hurricane-like winds is going to be able to creep in as well. And so making sure to kind of close those gaps are important. And while you're at it, adding a battery backup to your garage door just to make it easier, especially for elderly or those that have special needs. That helps ensure that garage is still functionable if the electricity is out. Moving on to number 9. When it's time to replace your windows, again, this can be a costlier item, but windows don't last forever. They can have damage or other items. So when you go to replace them, it's really important that you provide multi-pane windows. At least one of those panes should be tempered glass. But as you can see here, tempered glass is 4 to 5 times stronger than just the standard glass. So that really helps ensure that you're keeping that radiant heat from outside from breaking the window itself and then opening the window, making it susceptible not only to the radiant heat of the fire, but in the case of embers, from getting in and burning the home from the inside out. Next item, please. And then lastly, when it's time to replace your siding, again, we're wanting to use non-combustible ignition resistant materials. Stucco, metal, fiber cement, these are all common materials. This can be costly in itself, but when it's time to replace these items, make sure you're using these building materials that we've approved that really help resist ignition from embers. Next slide, please. We also have a list here. I won't go through all of these, but here's some no-cost ways that really enhance the effects of home hardening. So just making sure your home is built to Chapter 7A and you've retrofitted it to the current best available practices isn't enough. Having good defensible space around it, clearing vegetation around it. It was mentioned early on, a lot of research right now into the first 5 feet of structures. So those two as you see number 4 here, you're going to hear more and more about that as we roll out this new 0 to 5 foot zone and discuss, really expanding that portion of your defensible space. And all of that can cost nothing. but it enhances the effects of your home hardening. We can go to the next slide. So this shows you where you can get that low-cost retrofit list. This website is www.readyforwildfire.org. The address is right at the top of the screen here. And from that site, we have a lot of great educational materials, and you can get your home hardening list under the Prepare for Wildfire section, under Get Ready Home Hardening. And then right at the top is that low-cost retrofit list itself. Kind of going through, a little bit wrap up here. Mike, we can end the presentation when you're ready, but the loss of life and structures that we have seen really is at an all-time high. Turn on the news this summer, I don't need to tell you, it's evident that we're just continuing to see bigger, more destructive wildfires, and happening at a frequency and an intensity that really is nothing like we have seen in decades. In turn, here at CAL FIRE, we have really focused on increasing the pace and scale of our fire prevention activities. We're working to do more prescribed burning that was mentioned, doing fuel breaks around communities, inspecting for defensible space. So we are increasing our pace and scale of fire prevention efforts. But home hardening and really the retrofitting discussion is something that the average homeowner can do. There's cost barriers to it. And that's why we launched the low-cost retrofit list to try to overcome those barriers. But the state is working on creating a model where we're able to help provide financial incentives. Still working a lot of details out. There was an assembly bill passed not too long ago that charged Cal OES and CAL FIRE to look at putting together a program where we can take advantage of federal mitigation dollars and help with the retrofitting of homes. But I'll just leave it with, there is no silver bullet. We must continue to work on making our forests healthier, making sure that they're more resistant to drought and bark beetle, and then more resilient to wildfires. We have to build our communities so they're more resistant to wildfires, hardening our structures, not just our homes, but our communities as well. Maintaining defensible space at the home level, at the property level is critical. And then lastly, the closest item, and again, the focus today is hardening your home. And I know there's lots of discussion here about, how can, the insurance companies and how can incentives help with that. The end of the day, hardening your home does make a difference. The statistics back it up. Our recent fires back it up. And that's where we just need to continue to have this conversation of defensible space and home hardening. Those are elements that the homeowner, you, residents, those are efforts you can do to help reduce the impact from wildfires, start to reduce this trend of structure destruction in our wildland areas. Because at the end of the day, what we're seeing is it's not just high-risk wildfire areas that are having the effects of structure loss. We're seeing it in subdivisions, in communities, areas people may not be as cognizant or as aware of the wildfire dangers. But under hurricane winds, under the severity that we're experiencing, even if you live miles away from a wildland area, even on the other side of a 6-lane freeway, you're still susceptible to wildfires. And so ensuring you have good defensible space, ensuring that you've hardened your home are all critical elements. So with that, Mike, thank you very much. And I hope that you all find the low-cost retrofit list helpful. Again, that website, readyforwildfire.org.
Thank you, Chief Berlant. Really appreciate your presentation, and thank you for sharing your expertise and all the tools that CAL FIRE has prepared for the public. These are important, and I encourage the folks who are tuning in today to take a look at those on CAL FIRE's website. So thank you for everything that you do. I next want to introduce Shelly Yerkes, who's a Senior Professional Product Manager at CoreLogic. And it looks like her presentation is up. So without further ado, Shelly, the floor is yours.
There we go. Much better. So thanks, Mike. And thank you, Commissioner Lara, for giving us an opportunity to speak. And I'm hoping that my discussion is going to build upon and tie together some of the really insightful messages that we've heard here today. Now, the wildfires of the past several years have demonstrated that as property owners, as insurers, as communities, we're in an unsustainable situation in regards to managing wildfire risk, and it's created this crisis of affordability and availability of insurance. So how can we do better? So let me take a minute to explain what I mean by unsustainable. So experience and history has never worked well to help us manage insurance rates. With this chart or graph, I want to show you that before the year 1930, almost 40 million acres burned every year in the United States. After that, the US Forest Service mandate became to suppress every fire all the time to protect life and property. So by about 1980, through really heroic efforts, acreage burned had dropped to about 4 million annually, but now we're paying a price because in the past 20 years, the lack of fires have allowed fuels to accumulate in our forests and our foothills. And now there's so much fuel that some fires have not been able to be controlled, and our desire to suppress all fires is now unsustainable. So after 9 decades, our forests have changed. So historical forests, you can see in that graphic, in their natural state, they have limited ground fuels and they have generous spacing in between trees. Our forests used to contain maybe 50 trees per acre, a little more. Today, our modern forests have up to 1,000 trees per acre. And we have drought and bark beetle infestations in California that have left over 100 million trees dead where they stand. Now, we've had some new programs and policies enacted by utilities and state and federal agencies, but it's going to take time for those to have an impact. So forest conditions are not in equilibrium, and our current methods of controlling them are unsustainable. So exacerbating the fuels issue are the changes that we're observing in our climate. We're seeing longer, hotter seasons that create ideal conditions for wildfire growth. And now it's been difficult to keep larger fires in check. Destructiveness and damage is increasing, and it's creating an unsustainable situation from a human and economic perspective. It's just as important to see where property is so we can understand how the risk is growing in California. Now, the oranges and yellows here in the red circles are what I'm going to focus on right now. 8 million acres of the state is in the wildland-urban interface that we call the WUI. It's where homes meet areas that have vegetation that's prone to burn. Now, when I was a kid in San Diego, we saw fires burn in the backcountry almost every year, but they weren't catastrophes because hardly anybody lived there. But in the past 30 years, over 60% of our new homes have been built here, and now we have almost 7 million homes in these high-risk areas. So what does the WUI look like? If you look at this lower right map, the purples and the yellow shadings are the WUI. There's hundreds of communities now in California that are built right up to the edge of wildlands, like the subdivision you see in this photo. Many of us in the audience live in the WUI, and there are limited restrictions or abatements on development in these areas, and this is where most of the damage has been occurring in the past 15 years. So how can consumers, insurers, communities, how can we confront today's wildfire risk when it's not reflected in the experience data we have? We know we can't use past experience to set stable insurance premiums or create a sustainable insurance marketplace because conditions have never been stable. And as Nancy stated earlier, we need a way to measure and understand our forward-facing risk profile. We have the science to do this, and it's been used for decades for other perils like earthquakes and hurricanes, as we've heard. These analytic models are called probabilistic catastrophe models because they measure the probability or the likelihood of a wildfire causing property damage. So I'll explain how these models work by first explaining the physics of a wildfire. And we've heard a little bit about this today, and I'll build on it. The main components of a wildfire are listed here. They all contribute to the size and the heat intensity of a fire. And then a fire impacts property that sits in the way. So I've colored some of these ovals darker blue to illustrate that these are components over which we have some level of control. We can try to reduce ignitions. Over 80% of ignitions are caused by humans. So as citizens, we can be more careful, and utilities are also working hard to reduce ignitions that are caused by their equipment. Now, we've heard about this a lot today too, about how we can manage our vegetation differently, down from the landscaping in our yard up to our expansive national forests. We've also seen changes and improvements in suppression through better equipment, better technology, and different strategies in fire science. We've heard a lot about how we control the resiliency of our properties too. And these are just a few of the things I've listed here that we've heard about today, where we can harden our homes and our communities to reduce our wildfire risk. So there's this burgeoning science behind the effectiveness of all these mitigation practices. We heard Roy Wright from the IBHS speak. His lab in South Carolina performs extensive research in this area. And all of these factors in the end determine the extent and level of property damage. So I mentioned before that we have the science to measure risk. We've had a number of experts today explain the science and how the models work, and I'll just boil it down a little more. The models are based on the same scientific framework as real wildfire anatomy and of current tactical models that are used by firefighting agencies. All of these models were developed and improved year after year in collaboration with subject matter experts and scientists within public and private research organizations. These components all align with the risk and our ability to mitigate it, and they allow catastrophe models to offer a rational method to evaluate the likelihood, the probability of property damage from a wildfire. So these models are also dynamic. So they can account for changes in ignitions, in fuels, in the management, and in suppression. They can even factor in and account for changes in climate. And then in the end, they simulate millions of fires, basically any fire that could possibly happen and the likelihood of them happening. Then they can factor in and account for the costs and credits of property mitigation efforts to reduce insurance premium. And then in the end, they provide a reasonable basis to project then what the damages and losses will be to property. And as these conditions all change, we update our model yearly to keep the model current. So the better risk models out there operate at the property level, and they include mitigation factors for homeowners and community action. So it's essentially bespoke for every structure. Now, the inputs into these models are everything that can be known about a property, like where is it? Because CoreLogic is a property data analytics company. We have databases that allow us to know where every structure in the state sits on the property, and we can model precisely to the corners of the building footprint, not down the street, not some back corner of the yard, that can give the wrong risk profile. We input how it's constructed, what it would cost to rebuild, what mitigations have been done to protect it against wildfire. And because the outputs then are custom for each structure, we can quantify the credits for the specific actions, and it can account for what homeowners have done to mitigate their own risk to reduce their premiums. So what are the outputs and how are they used? An important metric is that we provide from these models is the average yearly loss. We call it the average annual loss. It's the damage in dollars that can be expected on average every year for every single house. This is where the simulations come in. We simulate 300,000 different scenarios of what next year could look like for every structure. So basically that's like 300,000 next years, and millions of simulated fires that it could impact a home in the next fire season. We also provide what's called the loss probability distribution. That's just the probability of loss happening and the range of loss around the average yearly loss, because this helps insurers plan for the best and the worst case scenarios so that they have the funds to honor your insurance contract that's basically just a promise to rebuild your home if it's damaged or destroyed. So in 2018, we had one insurer that didn't have adequate funds to fulfill those promises, and they went insolvent, which hurt its policyholders. So probabilistic models guide insurers and they guide rating agencies in the assessment of these adequate funds so that they can fulfill their promises to us. So, personally, I get the stress that comes with not knowing if you can afford to protect your home. My background may be in earth science, but I'm just a member of the general public, and my own home was impacted by 2 huge fires just a few years apart, and it sustained tens of thousands of dollars in damage. My community was devastated twice, and then it hurt our ability to obtain affordable insurance. So we're all looking for a future that hopefully will not be like the past 15 to 20 years. So catastrophe models and the outputs have been relied on for decades by rating agencies, departments of insurance, and by insurers to understand the risk for earthquakes and hurricanes and other perils, and has been also used for wildfire outside of California. So we have the science to credibly measure wildfire risk in California, and these models are a reliable way to help guide us to better mitigation actions for a less risky and hopefully a more resilient horizon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Really appreciate your expertise and for sharing your presentation today. Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Max Moritz from the UC Cooperative Extension and the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he's a statewide wildfire specialist. Max, I'll get your presentation loaded up here if you could get ready to start your presentation.
Thanks, Mike. I am. I'm a little under the weather, so I will spare you the video and hope my voice holds out. Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk from the more from the scientific research perspective. I've spent the last 25 years studying wildfire and how to map hazard, how to figure out where high wind corridors are and how to factor them into the models. I've actually worked on developing new fire spread models because the old traditional ones actually are quite sensitive and somewhat subjective. Climate change models, et cetera, et cetera. In the last few years, I've studied, I've started to look into home loss modeling. And so that's what I'm going to focus a little bit on today from what we've learned from the structure to the community scale. I'm not sure what you see. I see a giant blurry box that says slideshow and resume slideshow.
Max, do you see your slideshow now?
I do not. Does
Okay.
anybody else?
Hold on a second. Let me just start that over.
Okay. I guess I could also share my screen if we wanted to attempt that.
So you're not seeing anything at all at this point?
I am not.
And interpreter doesn't see it either.
Thank you.
Okay, just hold on for one moment. Let me fix this up, Max.
Sure.
Okay, I think you're set up, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, if you're seeing what I am, focus on the left-hand side of the screen. It's kind of in that presenter mode. So next, please. So often in a talk like this, I will start off by trying to lay the groundwork of defining what the problem is that we're trying to solve, because often people talk about the wildfire problem as this monolithic issue, and it's not having a specific problem that we're identifying as part of the miscommunication and the problem itself. Next. So in order to find solutions to these problems, we have to really hone in on what it is we're trying to fix. Next. Often there's a narrative that goes something like this that I hear from the public, policymakers, journalists, and it's a broken narrative, and it sort of exemplifies this problem. It starts off that we are having climate change, which is driving increased fire proneness in many parts of the world. And this is a model of that, some of those results from my lab, actually. And there's a lot of other studies that corroborate that this is indeed happening. Next. The linkage then is that there is, because of climate change and increasing fire proneness, we're often seeing larger, more severe forest fires, which is also a link that is credible and has been made in the literature. Next. And from this, we often hear the link that because of more climate change and forest fires, we're seeing more home losses. And this is where some of us in the scientific community start scratching our head a little, because there's not as much data here, but this is often the assumption that's made. Next. And that further along, because of more home losses and climate change and worsening forest fires, we're now seeing kind of these urban conflagrations, right? This is Coffey Park from the Tubbs fire. And I think that this conversation, this narrative, is worth examining. Next. Because the question here really is this a causal chain of events and impacts? And I think if you pick this apart a little, we learn from it. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So next. First of all, in many of these home loss situations, as others have pointed out already, it is the vegetation around the homes that's left standing. And the homes themselves are what ends up burning. The homes become the fuel. And this tells us an important lesson. This indicates that these are probably ember-driven ignitions that begin in one or a few structures and then carry the fire through the neighborhood. So it's not the vegetation around the homes necessarily, or the forest around the homes, that's causing these particular home loss events. Next. Next. Right, so this narrative has a break in here, because actually it's not necessarily that most forests are burning and the surrounding vegetation causing the homes themselves to burn. It's the homes that actually burn from embers and then become the fuel. And next. Most of these home loss events are not actually in what we would consider forests, right? Many of them are in the wildland-urban interface, which is some quasi-natural vegetation mixed with landscaping, and not in what we would consider our traditional mixed conifer forests. So next. What this highlights is that we have a couple of key problems here to worry about. One is that we have forest losses out there in the wildlands, and that climate change with drought, pest outbreaks, and increasing fire is going to probably make that problem worse, right? And that's a land management problem. Next. And a separate issue, somewhat related but somewhat distinct, is that we have this home loss problem in the wildland-urban interface, which is not a forest fire problem, but instead one of where and how we build, right? This is much more of a land use and urban planning issue, and the solutions here are not necessarily going to solve our forest loss problem, and the solutions to the forest loss problem are not necessarily going to solve our home loss problem. So keeping these distinct and an eye on the solutions for each is really important. Next. One of the take-home messages there is that landscape scale fuel treatments out there in our wildlands are important, but they're not likely to greatly reduce home losses, which tend to happen in high wind events where embers travel for miles. Doesn't mean that they're not important, but they're not necessarily going to reduce home losses. Next. Instead, retrofits to and immediately around the built environment will make them more survivable. Next. Some new work is showing us that actually where and how we build is also important, not just in losses themselves, but in fire probabilities. So we can build these models and break the models into the natural variables of climate, say productivity of fuels and the length and severity of the fire season. And here's a projection for the Bay Area into the future, looking at the importance of just the natural variables. And then next. And when you put in the human variables, the housing densities, the roadedness, where and how we're going to build, we see that human development patterns in the future can bump fire probabilities up or down. So actually this gives us an extremely important insight into what we need to think about in terms of future building and redevelopment when communities do burn. Where and how we build is incredibly important, not just in losses, but also in future fire activity. Next. Along those lines, although I'm not going to focus on it, we do have some guidance for new development, how to do it safer and make our communities more survivable. Granted, new development has many more options, more flexibility to deal with many of these problems than existing communities, which have already kind of put their footprint on the ground. But again, redevelopment can take advantage of some of these. Paradise, as an example, is looking at some buffers around the community. And this is a key issue with new development, try to have them more clustered, tightly clustered development with buffers around them. Next. So let's look at what we think we know now from a variety of different sources. We know that defensible space is important. Next. We also know that structure retrofits are important. We often hear a lot about these. We've heard about it today, and they are important. There are actions that can be taken that have real observable outcomes. Next. Quickly focusing on defensible space, because we've already heard about it. There's emerging evidence for a zone 0, which is not on this figure. But we have studies that go back for decades showing us that out to 100 feet, vegetation within the home ignition zone is important. There are also more recent studies that support that evidence. There are studies from other countries that also support this, although the distance varies of that zone away from the home. And so what we're seeing in the literature is that there are variable results that probably depend on the types of fires, the environment, the types of structure, characteristics, whether there's a defender there or not. All of these things come into play to make, to add uncertainty. But we do know that the defensible space is important and that doing something in that area is a step in the right direction. Next. In terms of structures, we've had a renewed awareness that it is embers that we need to worry about. Next. And here's the general ranking that we see. Roofs are important in materials and construction. Next. Screened vents. Next. Down the line, we hear about enclosed eaves, multi-pane window decks, gates. Next. Non-combustible siding, gutter covers. Different studies, different lists will put these in somewhat different orders, but this is generally the ranking. This is emerging from a combination of industry studies, agency analyses, peer-reviewed published research. But again, we don't have exact numbers of which counts for exactly how much, but this general ranking is pretty consistent. One thing to remember though, and I don't want to put a damper on all this, but while these are incredibly important, homeowner activities are also important. A homeowner can leave a window open, right? A homeowner can do all of these mitigation steps and still leave a window open, which all bets are off then, right? So it's important. That aspect of homeowner education is also important. Next. Okay, next. These are both important. Just to reiterate, there are observable benefits to all these. Next. What I want to touch on here just in a few seconds is that there are many hundreds of communities out there that need a retrofitting approach, right? And we need a comprehensive approach to this. We need something that addresses all different aspects of the problem. And often what is used is a community wildfire protection plan, a CWPP, which is basically focused on fuel breaks, and they do have a nod to structure retrofits. But we need something larger in scope and more comprehensive. Next. So I'm arguing for, and I'm going to try to pilot in the Central Coast area in a few communities, a regional wildfire mitigation program that focuses on not just the structures, how to rank, prioritize, and implement those mitigations, but also the people, right? You have to educate the people, fire-wise recognition or fire-adapted training, and then landscape, how to get buffers back on the landscape around existing communities to protect them, because we have to do all three of these in conjunction if we really want to make a difference. And that's all. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're on mute, Mike.
Thank you very much, Max. I appreciate your presentation, and thanks a lot for sharing your expertise here today. We are next I wanted to mention that we have two remaining speakers who will come after this before the end of the virtual meeting today. So I appreciate all of you for attending and participating. And what we'll do is just move directly to our next speaker, who is Lainey Quinn Davidson, who's a fire advisor and director of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, and associated with the University of California Cooperative Extension. So Lainey, I'll pull up your presentation here. Thank you very much for joining us. And as soon as it's up, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Okay. Great, there it is. Well, it's a real honor to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. And I'm going to bring a little bit of a different angle to the conversation. We just heard my colleague Max Moritz say something that I thought was powerful, that, you know, landscape scale fuels treatments are not going to necessarily protect the individual home. There is definitely truth to that, but I think that it's important that we think about fire resilience at all different scales. And, you know, one of the big things that I work on is thinking about fire adaptation, and that happens at the home level, at the community level, and at the landscape level. And that our most effective strategies are going to be those that include all of those different scales of action. So I was asked today to talk a little bit more about that landscape scale, about the fuels treatments that we are able to use to help protect communities and protect other resources at risk, and, you know, what some of those tools are and how we may best use them. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So I really like that. I really like this figure that helps us think about the different things that contribute to fire behavior and to fire regimes, again, at those different scales. So we have the scale of just the flame, and then how fire behaves on the landscape, and then also how fire behaves over longer periods of time and bigger spatial areas. I think one of the key things to see here is that vegetation and fuels really are a big part of the picture. They're one of the primary elements of what drives fire behavior and fire regimes. And they're something that we can focus on as part of a comprehensive and holistic approach to managing fire risk. You can go ahead and advance. One of my favorite papers that's come out in the last few years is a paper that looks at the ways that, that fuels interact with climate and with human communities. So this was a paper that was put out by Alan Taylor and some of his colleagues. And they set out, when they looked at this, when they started with this study, they were looking at the Sierra Nevada over a 400-year period. And they were trying to link fire regime changes, so the way that fire was behaving, both in frequency and severity over time, to climate patterns. And so they were, you know, trying to draw some parallels between changes in climate and what that meant for the way that fire behaved in the Sierra Nevada. They were having a really hard time making those linkages. And it was only when they looked at patterns of human development and settlement and human management of the landscape and of fuels and vegetation that they started to see some patterns. And so what they found is that human settlement, human management of fuels and of the landscape are actually able to mitigate the effects of climate. And this is a really powerful message. I think especially, you know, in the era that we're in now, where all we're hearing is how climate is driving everything, and it's so overwhelming and it's so disempowering. But we actually have some really strong evidence that our actions on the landscape level can really dictate the way that fire behaves. And next, Alexandra Seifert and some of her colleagues actually did a very similar study that looked at the entire country and found the exact same thing. The places where human presence is most prominent, the importance of climate is lower. So we really see that humans can influence fire regimes, and we can actually override the influence of climate. So I think this is a real call for action for us to be thinking about how we can manage fuels and manage fire on the landscape, and to know that we actually can. And there is historical evidence both in California and nationwide to suggest that we have that opportunity. Next. So what are some of those tools that are available to us to manage fuels and to manage vegetation at the landscape scale? Well, I'm going to talk today about prescribed fire, about mechanical treatments, and about grazing, which I really see as three of our top, you know, most effective strategies, but also kind of the most common and the ones that you're hearing about the most in the mainstream media and in these conversations that we're having about fire. Next. So prescribed fire is my passion. It's the thing that I work on the most. And for those of you who don't know, prescribed fire is the use of fire as a tool to meet predetermined objectives on the landscape. So we use prescribed fire in California for a wide variety of objectives, including fire risk reduction and fuels management, but also habitat restoration and invasive species control for cultural reasons. You heard Margot talk earlier about prescribed fire. This is a hugely important tool. And we know that it's one of the most cost-effective tools that we have available for treating larger landscapes. and also one of the most ecologically appropriate, especially in areas that are adapted to more frequent fires. So, you know, our forests, our woodlands, our grasslands. It's not the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. And in some areas, it's not appropriate. So, it's always important to consider the local context, the local fire regimes, and the future vision for the landscape and how prescribed fire might fit into that. On our federal lands, there are some very robust prescribed fire programs that are used to reduce fuels and for all of the other objectives that I talked about. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, the national parks, the Forest Service are all using prescribed fire, and they need more support to do more of that work. So there are some exciting developments at the national level to hopefully get them more funding and more support for that work. In the California context, CAL FIRE does have a prescribed fire program, the Vegetation Management Program, and they are really making effort to reinvest and revamp that program, which is great because for a long time it was not much of a priority for them, but we're really seeing CAL FIRE pour a lot more energy into that program, and I think that's great. Next slide. In recent years, there's also been a huge explosion of interest at the community scale in using more prescribed fire and kind of bringing fire back as a management tool on private lands outside of that agency influence. So there's been a lot of exciting work that I've been part of in starting local groups called prescribed burn associations and other community-based groups that are able to train up community members and landowners and really get prescribed fire back into the land management toolbox of these folks. So the map you see here represents some of the momentum and action that's happened just in the last 3 years around California. And the blue counties are the places that already have community-based prescribed fire groups that have formed. The orange are places where they're just starting to form, and the yellow are places where they're starting to think about forming community-based prescribed fire groups. My guess is that in the next 5 years, we'll see most of the state being blue. And this is exciting because it really means that communities are starting to take more ownership over fire and starting to recognize that they need to be more actively involved. And so this includes homeowners, landowners, forest landowners, ranchers. I think, we're all starting to realize that fire is part of all of our realities, and any ways that people can be involved in a positive way is going to be helpful. So this is really an important piece. Next. So mechanical treatments, when we talk about mechanical treatments, we're often talking about restoration thinning, where we're removing small trees and brush and leaving overstory trees. This, we're really talking more about forest lands here. And there are some great resources. We in California have a lot of science to back the idea that using thinning and in combination with prescribed fire to alter stand structure and to reduce fuels is hugely effective at increasing forest resilience and really, kind of changing the landscape of fire. So I highly recommend looking at the Fire and Fire Surrogate study that Scott Stevens from UC Berkeley and others have been working on for 20 years. They just recently put out some summary documents about that, but it's one of the most robust studies to help us understand the role of thinning treatments and prescribed fire in promoting forest resilience in California. So they've published over 40 papers out of that study, and just really comprehensive, from wildlife to fuels to biodiversity, and giving us a really good understanding. And one of the things that we see as most effective is in forest land areas is when you go in and you do some thinning and then you follow it with prescribed fire. So you're able to alter that stand structure and bring the tree density down, but then also bring fire in, restore fire as a process, and actually reduce the surface and ladder fuels that contribute to fire behavior during a wildfire. Next. A really nice example of this is from Whiskeytown National Recreation Area. And my husband's actually the fire ecologist for that park, and this is a map that he put together. But in this map, you can see surrounded in red, they're thinning and burning units. So those are units that they had gone in and done restoration thinning and then followed with prescribed fire before the car fire came. And so when the car fire burned through, you can see the difference that it made to have had those treatments in place beforehand. And so I think this is a really powerful visual. It's something that we know to be true, that if you go in and do thinning with prescribed fire, you will be able, in many cases, to alter the fire behavior and the losses in those areas. So if we're using treatments like this in a really strategic way around communities, you know, around other resources that we care about, we are able to have an effect. There are some other really great examples of this just from Northern California. There was a case in Weaverville where a prescribed fire was used in a really strategic way and actually was instrumental in stopping a fire that was kind of raging toward the town of Weaverville. So we have a lot of examples of this, and I think that idea that mechanical treatments followed by prescribed fire works is not disputed in the scientific community. Next. Now, one thing that we often don't think about in the fuels management context, and it doesn't get enough credit, I don't think, is grazing. And so in areas that are dominated by grasslands, grazing is a hugely important strategy for managing fuels and reducing fire risk. And so if you think about a lot of the areas where we've had some of the most damaging wildfires in recent years, places like Sonoma County, Redding, areas that are surrounded by grass and woodlands, we should really be thinking about how to strategically partner with folks like the California Cattlemen's Association and other groups that can bring grazing back into our fuels management toolbox. The picture on the right is from the Hopland, the Research and Extension Center in Hopland, and that area burned in the river fire back in 2018. And they had some really striking examples of the way that the fire burned through areas that were ungrazed and areas that had been grazed by sheep. And the picture tells the whole story, right? The grazing was hugely effective at reducing fire spread and reducing losses in that wildfire. So I think it's really important to keep grazing in our broader conversation about fuels management at the landscape scale. Next. Next slide. There we go. So just in closing, I think it's important for us as we think about all these issues and as we're thinking about home hardening and community planning, that we do keep the landscape scale in mind and that we remember that we can moderate wildfire risk and climate effects, but we have to keep that local context at the center of all of our conversations. We need to be thinking about the fire regimes, what the conditions are that we want to promote, what is our future vision for the landscape, and what are the fuels that we're dealing with, and how can we have a more holistic approach. And treatments need to be strategic. I think, we don't do enough treatments in the Western US to really be able to speak to how well they can work in protecting our communities. We need to be doing a lot more of this work, but we also need to be thinking really strategically about the location of those treatments, the timing of those treatments, and whether or not they're appropriate for the vegetation and the fire regimes that we're dealing with. So there's a lot of nuance here, and it's important to not just have one-size-fits-all approaches. We really need to be working with communities and figuring out what makes sense. And prescribed fire really is an essential tool. I mean, it's the reason why I focus most of my time on it. It's low cost, it's ecologically beneficial in many cases, but there are a number of barriers that need to be addressed, and some of those include insurance-related barriers. So I have been working with some folks at the Department of Insurance to explore some of those and brainstorm solutions, but we really do need to focus on how we can make a more conducive environment for prescribed fire, and definitely focusing on insurance as part of that. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be part of this, and that's all I have.
Great, thank you very much, Lainey. I really appreciate your expertise in sharing the landscape level mitigation that you've worked on. Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Seth Portner, who's the founder and adaptation specialist for Adaptation Services in Boulder, Colorado. And so Seth, I'll pull up your presentation. Thank you very much for being the last lap here on our wildfire mitigation and catastrophe models virtual meeting today. So thank you very much.
Mike, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And I just can't emphasize how much the quality of this conversation has just heartened me and giving me some optimism in 2020. So my name is Seth Portner. I'm the CEO of Adaptation Services Group. We are an organization that focuses on helping communities become more resilient at the residential scale to climate threats, basically. So obviously for today's conversation, we are speaking primarily about fire. We work across the spectrum of other issues, but we do primarily focus on fire. I will say that, you know, the first project that I worked on in this space after a 20-year career in working in utility and local government residential retrofit programs was creating Boulder County's Wildfire Partners program, which I think really comes directly to what a lot of this conversation is about, which is basically how do you create a community-based wildfire mitigation program? And that's the question I hope to answer today. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to give you some insight of how maybe a local government official, a local government policymaker might think about this issue. And then I'll zero in to the steps that we've gone through to then create community-based mitigation programs. Next slide, please. So, you know, we use a framework called community immunity. Timely this year, of course, it wasn't when we created it. And this is just how we might approach a local government to help them understand what climate-related threats they're facing, and then how to navigate through them, with our emphasis always being on how do you take action to solve the problem. Very specifically, we're interested in the residential sector. It's something I'll touch on multiple times in this presentation, but local governments tend to be very, very good at taking care of their infrastructure, you know, their roads, their bridges, their ports, their water treatment plant. They've been operating these facilities for many, many years, and they've seen many things happen over that time, whether that's wildfire or flood or other catastrophes, where they tend to be less able to engage as at the residential scale. And I think my presentation will elucidate why that is. It's because it's hard, it's very difficult, and there's a lot of obviously issues around ownership, the mix of ownership and responsibility for that property. Next slide, please. So identify the issue. This is where we like to start. And so we do community-driven adaptation planning. And what that means really is bringing to the community the latest in modeling on climate. So we start there for a lot of reasons. That isn't necessarily the required starting point, but for us, it gives policymakers a tangible tool to begin to think about how to interact in their community. You know, a lot of these models will go out to 2100, so you have an 80-year timeline. Obviously, it helps put a little context to maybe what they're already experiencing. I have never worked with a community where, you know, what the model found didn't align with their actual on-the-ground experience. And it also gives them context across a planning horizon. I think Mr. Moritz said this so articulately. You know, it lets them, for example, think about planning land use and development. You know, if they know that over this next 80-year, 100-year timeline, that they're going to be increasingly seeing more of maybe what they're experiencing now, let's say in terms of fire, at least the models point that way, it allows them to engage, for example, their development community on that issue. One of the key things about this too is it really offers us an opportunity to have a local government-wide community conversation. So, you know, I think we can all agree that oftentimes local governments are quite siloed. Through this process, we try to invite in all manners of department, nonprofits, the fire department, for example, to have a conversation about what the models may have found. In California, it is no surprise, as most of the West, hotter and drier. Next slide, please. So from there, once we've sort of gone through that process with the community, we have shared the modeling with them. We have identified what core issues would be. So in California today, we're talking about wildfire, of course. In other parts of the world, it's high heat. Of course, that's true in California. In other parts of the world, it's sea level rise. Of course, that's also true in California, I'm sorry to say. The first thing that we want to do is ask them to engage in an educational campaign. And I think this has come up. I think Cal Fire spoke about this quite a bit. It's important that the community understand not just what the problem is, but the why of the problem, and that there are solutions. Local governments, and this can be municipalities, townships, counties, there are other quasi-governmentals that, fire districts, for example, that could be running this sort of campaign. They're very powerful. They have typically a very good method to outreach to people already. And so beginning this conversation around, for example, wildfire threat and perhaps, doing home retrofitting, building a campaign around that is something that can happen with ease for local government. Next slide, please. Prioritize at-risk zones. I won't spend a ton of time here, but I just want to, lead you with a thought that if you're a local government and you're facing an issue such as repeated wildfire or the threat of wildfire in your community, we strongly advocate that as part of this planning process that you look at those vulnerable areas. And so that can be based on, for example, the age of the structures. I think CAL FIRE touched on this very well. Newer buildings have been built to a higher code. They're going to be more fire resistant. Older buildings, not so much. We can look at very specific strategic areas, places that are probably at higher risk of fire, and if they burn, might create more of a problem. And the one that's most important for us, and I think you'd find the local governments would agree, is, where it's so often the case that the people, the lowest income people are in the most dangerous spot. And I have worked with more communities that I care to admit that have lost the entirety of their workforce housing, have lost entire, communities where the artists live because the housing was in the place that was most endangered. So we like to prioritize looking at those areas first. Next slide, please. So take action. So that's really just saying, once we've gone through this process with the community, we want them to do something about it. And that's, of course, the hard part. That's where the community has to make an investment. There are, I think, increasingly dollars available through the federal government, through FEMA. CAL FIRE discussed how they're freeing up dollars for residential hardening. So, the logical manager for that is, again, on the local level. That's going to be the municipality, that's going to be the county, that could be the fire district. So we want to see action come out of that. And that action, is looking around at all of the key players. It's prioritizing the areas that are probably most imperiled. And it's looking towards a program, some sort of outreach, some sort of campaign, some sort of structure to that campaign that can actually achieve, in this case, the wildfire retrofits that need to happen. A couple of other things that communities are going to want to think about are, for example, a contractor network. Somebody has to do this work, and I think it's something that I didn't hear come up today, but this is often the most difficult, harsh part of a program like this, which is assembling, creating a sustainable contractor network, a base of vetted, insured, competent contractors. This can be a pretty substantial project, and of course, in more rural areas, it's even more difficult. It was talked about by Mr. Moritz about codes, for example. This is another, this is an area where the local governments can take action immediately, and we would suggest would be part of the process, and thinking about future development. And then the final thing as it pertains to action, and some really critical thoughts here, what are the things that they want tracked over time? And I think in my work, this is the thing that I have learned to be the absolute most compelling thing. When we are talking about, say, community-based wildfire retrofits, who's tracking what people are doing? And I think the academics here would probably appreciate this the most. Do we know how each property was treated? Do we know, was it annually maintained? Do we know exactly what measures were done and when, and who did them, and when were they done correctly? On the most granular level might not seem relevant, but for example, after a fire, having this information is absolutely critical. And over time, it becomes more valuable because it will allow us to really identify where we should be investing in terms of measures. Other things to think about are long-term maintenance and management. Wildfire retrofit, it's not something you do once. It's something that needs done over time. It's really a relationship with your property. changing tenancy. Not every home is occupied by a permanent resident. You could go in there and educate the current resident only for them to move out next month, then you have a new resident. So these are things that need thought about. And of course, changing climate, where we are today with a specific neighborhood subdivision community is not necessarily where they're going to be in 10, 20, or 50 years. And that's why we bring climate adaptation planning to the table, so we can talk to them how that is going to change over time. Next slide, please. So drilling down to what a residential scale program would actually look like, I just want to give you a handful of thoughts. One, this is a very well-worn path, folks. There's nothing about this that is new. So if you just want to choose your county, you're in Peril County in California, the idea that they would really take ownership for the homes in their community to help the community achieve retrofit and enhance their resiliency, this has been going on for as long as there have been local governments and homes. You can think about energy, energy efficiency programs, solar programs. You can think about public health. Today in Alabama, the water table has risen so much to render the septic that many homeowners use useless. So, these issues come up over and over and over again where the housing stock needs to be adapted. Of course, it's true in water and fire. So we advocate, again, we're thinking about a local government that has, or fire district has decided to take responsibility for the homes in their community and help them achieve retrofit. We're going to do some sort of marketing campaign. It's going to say, look, there's some resources available here. There's help available here to help you figure out how to get your home retrofitted for wildfire. We like to start with an audit process. And so what that is a third-party auditor and inspector. The best ones of these that I've hired over the years are, somebody who was a waiter in college and then went on to be a wildland firefighter. They understand, people. The best one I ever had sold Cutco knives, door to door. They understood how to talk to homeowners, but they also understand, of course, fire behavior, and they can read the landscape. And they also will need to know a little bit about home construction. So in that instance, in this sort of program, very similar to, say, Boulder County's Wildfire Partners program, we would dispatch this third-party inspector to the home at the request of the homeowner. Of course, there may be a fee involved that the homeowner would pay. It may be something that the local government or some other third party chooses to pay for. They walk the property with the homeowner, and they just generally identify, what's the situation on the landscape. I'll go into a little more detail on this, but I think it's been very well covered with kind of the general zones, 3, 2, and 1, and defensible space. They will discuss the property itself, the house, the structure, the age of the structure. They'll understand just visually what the risks are inherent in that style of structure. They'll identify the geography that's local, the strategic location of the house. This is a critical, important, risk is not evenly distributed. It is, of course, more extreme based on things like the slope and even the location of the home and its proximity to its neighbors. Did the neighbors retrofit? That makes it all the more important that this home retrofits, so we can really knit together some resiliency, for example, on a cul-de-sac in a subdivision. Local knowledge that inspector's going to have because they've walked other properties in that area, thereby making the process more efficient and effective. And then, of course, we want that auditor to, as I mentioned, we want them to understand the human touch. It's critically important. Folks don't undertake any sort of activity on their home without deep consideration, and they have really large competing priorities. When you're talking about a retrofit like this, maybe from our perspective, if you're a firefighter or if you're in the insurance industry, it seems so obvious that you just need to protect the home. But for a homeowner that's maybe lived on that piece of land for 10 years and never had a fire, they may view that differently. And of course, they have a lot of competing priorities. So it's critical that in any sort of program that endeavors to get retrofits to happen, that it's understood to meet the homeowner where they are. The other tools that are in the toolkit are some social norming, community-based social marketing, neighborhood values. In other words, Just for example, 3 of the 5 neighbors on this cul-de-sac have already participated in this program, and we're all, we're making this whole neighborhood safer. There's a lot of that begins to play out when you can prop up a retrofit program such as this. The other critical, thank you, we can stay on the slide for one more second. The other reason that we like to have a third party do this is that, and this really hasn't come up that I'm aware of, it's a lot of contractors that are involved in a residential scale program. So we talked about roofs maybe being needed to be replaced, and that comes up a lot, of course. Windows, maybe a deck needs to be replaced. That general home hardening that we talked about, that's typically yet another contractor that could be a handyman. It doesn't need to be a high-skilled contractor, but it does need to be a contractor. Creating that defensible space, that's a landscaper. And then if there's some thinning that needs to happen, that is yet another contractor. And oh, by the way, and I think Chief Berlin really articulated this well, a lot of this is do it yourself. Well, you just want to think about like who really walks the homeowner through that process of here's some work that you can do, here's the work that a landscaper can do, and here's the work that you're going to need to hire out to, for example, a roofing contractor or an arborist. Next slide, please. So, I don't want to spend a ton of time here. I think that we've really sort of walked through like what maybe these measures look like. I want to say really clearly that having been in working on home retrofit for a very long time, it's important to understand that this isn't etched in stone, and that, as I said before, in an ideal world, we're really collecting information about what happens at the home level. And then unfortunately, we will no doubt experience some fires. And then from there, we will have the opportunity to evaluate what measures work. But this is a work in progress, and we are really on the first step of this journey, in my opinion. And so over time, what we understand about how to protect a home is going to change. And that's what makes, doing these community-based programs all the more important, because it provides us a great opportunity to gather information, to learn. The academics will have a chance to really analyze what happened and then help us redirect towards the measures that we know can make the biggest difference. And there's another thought that I really want to share, which is this idea of performance versus prescriptive. Again, if you can sit in the chair of the homeowner, and of course that's many of us sitting here and many of us that live in the WUI or in a wildfire imperiled area, some things are non-negotiable around our houses. And so, we can't come at everybody with a prescriptive path, like you shall remove every piece of vegetation, within X feet of your home. For many people, that's just going to be a non-starter. They're looking out at that tree, as I am here in my home, where my daughter swings every day. And that tree's not coming down, and nobody's going to tell me differently. So that's why we like to talk about a performance-based path, where we could say, well, the tree can stay if we can do these 5 other activities. And again, this is about meeting people where they are. I think I have one more slide. I do, thank you so much. This is basic program design. So I just want to walk you through this. So as I hope in California, we gravitate towards these community-based programs, the things that we need to think about. The barriers for a homeowner is, the first one is just accepting the risk, and then becoming educated that there is something that they can do about it and that the risk is real. Cost is real. I was very nervous to put a number in here. This number really means nothing. I mean, there's so many styles of houses and so many styles of acreage. But what we have found in the programs that we have run is that you kind of see a cluster of low costs, do a lot of do-it-yourself activity and then some really basic improvements, maybe removing a few trees. And then you see another cluster at higher cost of folks that, had to put in a really proper defensible space, maybe remove some more trees. And then you have very high cost of people that need to do some actual thinning. Contractors, they're your asset, they can be a barrier. You're going to need several on your typical retrofit project. And that's why you want that third party involved, because any one contractor might say, yeah, you're done, you're good. When of course, because that's the service that they provide, that may or may not be true. And then that contractor community needs to be cultivated, vetted, and matured over time. That need for annual management and maintenance, again, that points back to that third party, somebody that's going to, reach back out to the homeowner and say, hey, it's time to mow those grasses, my friend. It's time to clear brush again. This is something that we do every year. Let's clean out those gutters. We don't have to send somebody out there to do it. They don't have to hire a contractor, but they do need reminded. And from a data management and long-term thinking perspective, we want to know what maintenance was done on that house over time. Homeowner benefits, what's in it for them? Why are they going to do this? Is of course increased resiliency. Perhaps, depending on the things that they may have done to actually harden the structure, increase in home value. Certainly, if they've done substantial thinning on their property, increased value. And believe it or not, again, if you get down to the most bottoms up level, down to the granular level, there's real community cachet when you have an entire street, for example, or an entire subdivision that is banded together to do residential retrofitting together, and they can look at their neighbors and they know that they've all done the right thing. And I think I've touched on sort of that information tracking and how and why that is so very important. So that's it from Seth with ASG. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you very much, Seth. I really appreciate your perspective, having worked with thousands and thousands of people to mitigate their properties against wildfire. This is really helpful, and so thank you for sharing today. Wonderful. So this concludes our virtual meeting today on wildfire mitigation and catastrophe modeling. If you'll just bear with me one moment, Okay, great. I want to just provide a few synopses and conclusions from today. The focus of today was technical, scientific, educational, and I want to reiterate that it really does focus on two fundamental questions that Commissioner Lara has identified. How, if at all, would the use of catastrophe modeling in rate making help make homeowners insurance more affordable and more widely available to homeowners? And how can home and community-wide mitigation reduce the spread and risk of future wildfires in California? We've heard from actuaries, we've heard from folks on the ground who've walked properties and worked with homeowners to reduce those risks. We've heard from catastrophe modelers, we've heard from researchers, and we've heard from risk management experts. And all that information and all those presentations are a portion of the academic and practical research and expertise that's out there. And these are all elements that the commissioner will use as the department makes decisions on how to move forward in the future. I appreciate all of your attendance. I realize that this is a major issue for the state, and I appreciate that we have so many different experts who are working on risk reduction in California. I want to end here by just thanking the presenters one more time, and also to say that for next steps, we're looking forward to hearing from those of you who've tuned in and those of you who watch this in the recording later. We want to hear your perspectives and reactions to the concepts and questions presented today. As a reminder, we request that you submit your comments in written form to the department by no later than January 11th, 2021. And you can email those comments to the email address that Commissioner Lara stated at the beginning, and I will restate now, which is cdiregulations@insurance.california.gov. Thank you all very much. My name is Mike Peterson. I'm the Deputy Commissioner on Climate Sustainability. And this concludes our virtual meeting on December 10th. Have a wonderful day and take care.
Thank you, Mike. Good job.